actually, usually by the second year of the core curriculum, I'm feeling like the topics are getting a little stale. We actually did so little instruction last year when we would have started teaching this particular curriculum. Of course, the pandemic set in, and I didn't do any teaching for the first half of the year. And then we've kind of slowly done a few core classes here and there, but really this curriculum is still fairly fresh. There's a few topics that are aged, and we aren't going to spend a lot of time on those topics anyway. But what's unique about this particular core curriculum from any that we've had in the past is that the Department of Licensing, when it created this 2021 curriculum, was targeting a specific problem. And it was a problem created by the border. And it wasn't your border, it wasn't Spokane's border with Idaho, it was Vancouver's border with Oregon. And the specific problem was that brokers who were only minimally familiar with our forms were creating enormous problems for consumers who were trying to use those forms, or they were trying to use those forms on behalf of the consumers, and really not understanding significant issues. So the Department of Licensing created this curriculum around targeting those specific issues that cause the most difficulty. And what we found is that these topics are actually really good discussion points for brokers all over the state, whether you're on a border or not, whether you've used these statewide forms since 2007 when they were first introduced, or whether you're a newer broker or just newer to the forms. So the first part of this class is going to focus on specific forms, and then we're going to hit a few broader topics before we're finished. But that's how the class format runs. As Emma mentioned, the curriculum is really jam-packed for a 3-hour period. There's a lot to cover, and so I'm going to move fairly quickly in covering things, but at the same time be as thorough as possible. I will pause and ask for questions probably at the end of each form. So as Emma mentioned, if you have a question that's triggered in your mind as we're talking, really truly the best way to give meaning to you, any of you in this class, is to be able to take what we're talking about in the class and apply it to what's really happening in your world. So with that, please do ask questions. And the way that we're asking you to pose your question is to just simply type in the chat room box the fact that you have a question. Just type the word question. And then when or maybe the best thing to do, type question in the topic. So for example, the first thing we're going to talk about is the escalation addendum, Form 30E. So maybe if you type question, Form 35E, then Emma will know that your question is on that topic. If we can get to all of the questions on Form 35E, we will. If we can't, then she'll know when we get to the next form that she'll skip those questions that we didn't get to on Form 35E, and we'll go on to the next round of questions. So that would be the best way to do it, but don't bother taking time to type out your whole question. I'm not going to read in the chat box. I'm doing as much as I can to stay focused on the Zoom room, and I am unable to teach and read the chat box at the same time. That's one thing I've learned about myself. We will take about a 10-minute break at the top of every hour, or whenever it's kind of a convenient time to take a break at around that time. So plan around that for phone calls and whatever else you need to do on a 10-minute break. All right, let's share the screen and get going. I don't think that worked. Let's try it again. Whoops. Oh, I am screen sharing, but not the screen I wanted.
I see your PowerPoint, it looks like, Annie.
You can see the PowerPoint?
I can see the PowerPoint. So I see Washington Realtors as the front slide, it looks like.
Interesting. Okay. Did it jump to presentation? There we go.
There you go. Yep, you're big now.
Okay, and now I can see it on my screen also. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. Core 2021. So these are all the forms that we are going to talk about today. And as I said, the very first one is the escalation addendum. Don't worry too much about this particular slide, because we're going to cover each of these forms identified on the slide with its own slide, or 2 or 3 as the case may be. So the escalation addendum, in today's market, and I know Spokane is just as crazy as everywhere else in the state, the likelihood is that if you have a well-priced piece of property, you are going to receive multiple offers. And some of the buyers who are trying to compete for that property are likely to include an escalation addendum. So in today's market, regardless of what we may or may not think of this form, you are likely to see this form. You may even use this form on behalf of a buyer, even though you recognize the weaknesses of this form. Why is that? Because the buyer who has lost out on the last 5 houses that they've tried to purchase because they've been outbid say, look, I don't care what I have to do. I'll do anything to get this property. And we are seeing buyers do absolutely reckless things in the name of being the buyer. Yesterday, I received a question on the hotline from a broker who was representing the seller, but concerned because they had received a form, and it was a franchise form. So it was a form prepared by a franchise. It was not Windermere. And the addendum, though, set up a paradigm for buyer, explaining that in a competitive market, buyers sometimes want to waive contingencies that are considered industry standard contingencies. And it instructs the buyer that if they do that, if they waive these contingencies, and then there's a checkbox they can go down the side of the left side of the form, waiving inspection, waiving financing, waiving title review, whatever it is, waiving all the standardized contingencies, that if they do that, their earnest money may become maybe forfeited to seller if they're unable to close the transaction. And then the last box is an opportunity for the buyer to agree that their earnest money will be considered as non-refundable. It will be immediately released to the seller.
It's mute now, but I don't hear any talking.
Okay.
Okay, let's make sure our mics are muted, guys.
Oh yeah, listen to it.
Hold on.
Listen to it all the time.
Who has their mic on, guys? Let's turn that off. Sorry, looking through everyone to see if I can help.
Whoever was talking said they couldn't hear me though. Emma, you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Okay, I'll go through and find out which mics are on, and go ahead. Keep going, Annie. Thanks.
Okay. So anyway, on this particular form, this buyer had marked that box and had put $40,000 down as earnest money that they were agreeing would be non-refundable, whatever that means. And please don't take what I'm saying right now as any endorsement for whatever non-refundable earnest money would mean. I'm a huge opponent. I oppose dramatically and aggressively any idea that earnest money will be non-refundable or released to seller. And we can talk more about that if you'd like to. It's not really part of my topics for discussion today, but it's really important in today's market, and I'm happy to go there if you want to. But anyway, what this form was essentially setting this buyer up to do was to pay the seller $40,000 in exchange for what? Buyer's paying seller $40,000 in exchange for seller's signature on a purchase and sale agreement. And that's it. And the form does go on to say that because then the $40,000 is being released to the seller the day after mutual acceptance. And the form goes on to say that if the sale fails to close due to no fault of buyer or because of the fault of seller or something like that, that the buyer will get their earnest money back. But it says nothing about how the buyer is going to get their earnest money back. And if you give $40,000 to a seller and then 45 days later you say, hey, seller, I need that $40,000 back because you failed to close the transaction, what's the likelihood the buyer is going to at least easily get that $40,000 back, or maybe get that $40,000 back at all? And hopefully you're sitting in your chair at home going, that's probably not a very good chance the buyer is going to get that earnest money back. So I want you to think about the culture that we're creating right now within the real estate industry by giving buyers this mindset that it is okay to be absolutely reckless with the way that they make offers. Because when you, as their real estate broker, draft an offer for a buyer or create a purchase and sale agreement for buyer and seller, you are engaged in the practice of law. And the Supreme Court of Washington State has said that you are authorized to engage in the practice of law to the extent you're filling in the blanks on pre-printed standardized forms for the purchase of creating a real estate purchase and sale agreement between two third parties. But when you do that, you're held to the standard of care of a lawyer.
Because that thing, Popped up, says I'm muted by the host. I think it said that.
Okay, sorry, I'll fix that again. Hey, Jason, I think
Did
it's yours.
I did it all the other times, but
unmuting.
oh, you're not on mute. You need to mute. It's on mute.
Nope, Jason, you're not on mute. Or Jim, sorry, it looks like Jim Faro. If you could.
So anyway, it won't work. So okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, so that was my kind of background pitch for where we are as an industry and the reckless buyer culture. And you're going to be hearing more about this from me and from maybe even other industry lawyers in days to come. We are going to focus on this as an issue because I am firmly convinced it's only a matter of time before the market that we're seeing right now is no longer sustainable. We have buyers who lose a lot of money in this process of trying to purchase properties, and somebody's going to get sued. And if the seller no longer has buyers $40,000 earnest money, it's just not a tough equation to figure out who that buyer is going to sue. And it's going to be one of you. It's going to be a real estate broker. It's going to be a real estate firm. And I'm, as counsel to the industry's trade association, I'm very concerned about that. So we'll talk more about that. But it leads us to the discussion of the escalation addendum. So understanding that the escalation addendum is used by the buyer who says, look, I so desperately want property to purchase and I haven't had a chance to buy one yet because I get outbid. I want to tell the seller that I'll pay whatever I have to pay to get their property. I want their property so much that I'll pay what they're asking, plus I'll pay whatever else I have to pay in order to beat the next highest buyer. That's what the escalation addendum says. It is a wholly imperfect form. I will tell you that the form is being revised, and it is going to be a better form when the revised form comes out later this year. But what we have to work with right now is the existing form. And so we are going to talk in this class about what some of the problems are with the existing form and how you can moderate around those problems. What the form says is that the buyer will pay X number of dollars up to a cap. So they'll pay $1,000 more than the next highest competing offer. And I'm putting competing in air quotes because that term is of monumental significance to the operation of this form. And you've got to understand the term competing offer in order to understand how to use the form. And so we're going to talk more about competing offer in a minute. But the buyer's saying that they'll pay whatever amount, let's say $1,000 more than the competing offer, up to a maximum cap of, let's say, $400,000. Let's say that the purchase price was, the list price was $325, buyer offers $325, and they're going to pay $1,000 more than the next highest purchase price, up to, let's say, a cap of $400,000. Okay, seller gets that offer. Now, what does seller do with that offer? First thing that seller does is recognize that they have a buyer who's not just eager, but insane to get this property, right? They're going to pay $75,000 more than the list price. So there's naturally a number of concerns that seller's going to have, like, is this real? What if the house doesn't appraise that high? Does buyer really have enough money to do this? But listing broker is going to have to help the seller bring some understanding to the form so that seller can figure out whether or not there's even a way to get to buyer's $400,000. Because just the mere fact that buyer says, I'll pay up to $400,000 doesn't mean the buyer's obligated to pay up to $400,000 unless the seller can escalate the buyer to that amount. How does the seller escalate the buyer to that amount? That's where competing offer comes in. In order to escalate the buyer's purchase price, the seller has to have a competing offer, and a competing offer is any viable offer made by an arm's length buyer that presents the seller with cash at closing. It doesn't have to be a cash offer. It could be a buyer relying on financing, but to seller is going to get cash at the closing table. It cannot include a Form 22B home sale contingency. And then this one is really important and it's overlooked often. The closing date of the competing offer must be not more than whatever number of days is filled in on that blank space. And it's 60 days by default. So if you put nothing on that blank space, and by the way, you should have copies of the forms and the materials that were provided to you. If you don't, then grab one of the forms, grab the forms that, off of your forms provider website if you need to, as we're looking at them. I want you to have the forms in front of you. The boilerplate, if you don't do anything on that box, will say that the competing offer for the buyer's broker. I want you to think about the strategy of this form. If you're the buyer's broker and you have a buyer who is making a truly cash offer, and their offer is not requiring time for loan processing in order to close. So your buyer can close their transaction, their purchase, in say 20 days, and you see that as a benefit to the seller, particularly if the house is vacant already. Then your buyer, who's including an escalation addendum, probably doesn't want to be competing against other buyers who have to get financing. So one way that your buyer could rein in some of the recklessness of the Form 35E escalation addendum is to narrow the time period that a competing offer can have to close. So instead of leaving that blank or writing 60 days in that blank, you might write 30 days or 20 days. If your buyer's offer is going to close in 20 days, maybe you'd write 20 days. But understand the value of that provision. The form goes on to say that if the seller escalates the purchase price, and I want you to understand the dynamic of this form. Let's say the seller escalates the purchase price, makes no changes to buyer's offer at all. No changes to buyer's offer. All the seller does is go through the math equation on the bottom right-hand side of the escalation addendum, achieves an escalated purchase price, writes that down there, seller signs that, initials everything, sends it back to the buyer. In that scenario, answer in your own mind this question: has seller accepted buyer's offer or countered buyer's offer? And the answer to that question is that seller has accepted buyer's offer. It's not a counter offer. Buyer has no opportunity to come back and say, hey, seller, wait a minute, you calculated that price wrong. So therefore, I'm not agreeing to close the transaction on your terms. Buyer doesn't have that ability because seller has accepted buyer's offer, which is why the language of Form 35E is really particular about saying that if seller has calculated the price incorrectly and written the wrong price at the bottom of Form 35E, then at the closing table, the purchase price will be what the purchase price should have been had seller calculated the price correctly. So in our scenario, seller and listing broker might have thought that they had a buyer, a competing buyer, that allowed them to escalate all the way up to $400,000 for the purchase price of this property. And seller did that. Seller wrote $400,000 at the bottom of 35E, signed 21, initialed everything else, sent it all back over to buyers, heading to the closing table, thinking that they've got a purchase price of $400,000. And remember that seller must provide back to buyer a copy of the competing offer. So buyer gets a copy of the competing offer, and where buyer had written 60 days into or had left this blank. I'm sorry, buyer. I'm sorry. In our example, buyer had written 20 days because they were a cash buyer into this blank. But the competing offer that's delivered back to buyer as the competing offer that escalated the price had a closing date 45 days from mutual acceptance, then I hope you see that that competing offer was not truly a competing offer as defined by the form. And as a result of that, the escalated buyer's purchase price did not escalate. That's what the language of Form 35E says, is that if the calculation is done wrong, or if the competing offer is not truly a competing offer, then the price does not escalate to the number that's written at the bottom of Form 35E. If the competing offer was truly a competing offer, but the calculations were done wrong, then the price will escalate to whatever it should have been had the calculation been done correctly. But if the competing offer is not even a competing offer, there's no escalation, period. So this seller who thought they had a $400,000 purchase price actually has a $325,000 purchase price. And but for the listing broker's mistake regarding the escalation addendum, seller could have accepted another offer at whatever the price would have been, let's say, $399 or something like that. But they didn't, because they went with this offer instead. And listing broker made a mistake in the calculation of the escalation price. That's where there is enormous risk to the use of Form 35E. And in my example, seller's the one who's going to pay the price. It could go either direction. There could be a mistake either direction. What I recommend, if you receive an offer as a listing broker with an escalation addendum in it, listing brokers explain to sellers the risk of the form. This form will not give us any notice if we've made a mistake until we get to closing, or certainly until it's too late. After you've already accepted the buyer's offer, even if it's based on a mistake, and I'm going to try not to make a mistake, but let me tell you, brokers make mistakes with this form every single day. If our calculation is based on a mistake, then the price will be something different at the closing table. So seller, my suggestion to you is that we use buyer's escalation addendum to negotiate the purchase price, but we don't use it to escalate the purchase price. And here's what I mean by that, seller. You've actually got two offers. You've got what I think is a competing offer, and we could use that competing offer to raise the price up to $400,000. But rather than doing that, seller, here's my suggestion. Let's go back to the buyer whose price we want to escalate to $400,000. I'm going to send a copy of what I believe to be the competing offer to the buyer's broker. I'm going to talk on the phone to that buyer's broker and explain to them that if we chose to escalate, then we could do so up to $400,000, make sure they agree with me on that. And if they do agree with me, I'm going to suggest to them that you, seller, will not accept the offer as on an escalation addendum. There's too much risk associated with that, but that you will sell the property to their buyer for $400,000. And so if their buyer wants to purchase the property for $400,000, now pay attention to what I'm about to say, because it's different than what I've said on a video. If the buyer will pay $400,000, then buyer broker, you need to send us a new offer from your buyer, taking out the Form 35E and increasing the purchase price to $400,000. Upon receipt, my seller will accept that offer from buyer without change, without making any revisions to it. How is that different? What I've said in videos is, seller, you're going to counter buyer's offer at $400,000, eliminating the 35E and send it back over to buyer once buyer broker has said, yeah, my buyer will pay $400,000. I'm not counseling that way anymore. I'm not educating that way anymore. Instead, I'm saying, don't counter. Instead, ask the buyer to send you a revised offer at the $400,000 price. Why? Because if your seller counters, the seller's counter constitutes a rejection. Anytime an offer is countered, it's considered a rejection of that offer. A rejected offer becomes a void offer. It has no meaning whatsoever anymore. And if it happened to turn out that the buyer whose buyer broker said, yeah, my buyer will do this at $400,000, changes their mind and they don't accept seller's counter, now you've lost that offer as a competing offer to escalate the price on a different offer, or to use to try and negotiate the same way to increase the price on a different offer. So in order to keep all offers on the table and viable, don't counter one. Instead, ask that buyer to resubmit a new offer at $400,000. With that, your seller can accept the offer and move on. Okay. Emma, do we have any questions so far?
Sorry, took me a second to unmute there. We have, let's see, a couple little questions here. Let me make sure I'm telling you the ones that are applicable for you. Let's see, question number one, would it be possible to do a Form 34 to confirm price?
So instead of that, here's what I'm going to tell you. I don't know how you'd use Form 34 to do that. You might be able to come up with a clever way of doing that, but I'm instead going to tell you that when the forms are revised later this year, the revision to this form will require, it's going to set up the paradigm the same way, that seller is going to give the price at the bottom of the form. But it's also going to say back to the buyer, if you disagree with this price, you have 3 days to let the seller know. buyer, if you don't let seller know, I think it's 3 days, it could be 2 days, I'm not sure. If you don't let seller know within whatever that time period is that you disagree with the price established on the bottom of the Form 35E, then you are locked into the price on the bottom of the Form 35E, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, regardless of whether the competing offer is truly a competing offer. So I understand where you're trying to go with the Form 34. I'm not going to encourage you to write your own language. I'm instead going to say, use this form very cautiously until the revised form comes out. And then if the revised form solves this problem for us as an industry, then it will be more reliable to use that form. Okay, if there's one more question on Form 35E, let's take that, and then we're going to do one more thing on 35E before we move on.
Sure. One more question on that real quick is, can you briefly explain why the original offer was not a viable offer?
An original offer may not be a viable offer if, for example, it has already expired before. That's the biggest issue that we see. Seller receives 4 offers. They list the property on Monday. They receive 4 offers by Thursday. They want to use offer number 1 to escalate offer number 4, but unfortunately, offer number 1 was made on Monday. It expired on Wednesday. So when seller tries to use it to escalate buyer's offer on Thursday, it's already expired. It's no longer a viable offer. It could not be used to escalate the offer on Thursday. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I've been telling you how difficult it is to calculate purchase price using the escalation addendum. I want you to take a few minutes and practice so we can talk about how you actually calculate price using this form. So using the slide that's in front of you, here's what I want you to do. I want you to assume that you are the listing broker and you have 2 offers. Your offer number 1, both offers include a Form 35E escalation addendum. Offer number 1 offers to purchase the property at $220, includes a 35E that will escalate $500 over the next highest offer up to a maximum purchase price of $240. That buyer is asking the seller to pay $4,000 of buyer's closing costs. The second offer offers a purchase price of $225, escalating $1,000 over the next highest offer with a cap at $238. And that buyer is asking the seller for $500 credit for repairs. Now, I want you to take these 2 offers, and as a listing broker, I want you to calculate which offer seller should accept based on the yield of seller's proceeds. So which offer creates the highest seller proceeds? Every single term, other term of these offers is exactly the same. Now, I know this isn't real world, but it works for us to be able to make sure that you understand how to use the Form 35E calculation tool. And here's what I'm going to suggest to you also. Pull out your Form 35E, and on the bottom of the Form 35E, where you have the calculation lines, you have the blank lines that run horizontally. Draw a vertical line down the center of those blank lines, and write offer number 1 or buyer number 1 at the top of the left column, offer number 2 at the top of the right column, and then calculate the price for both of those. I'm going to give you about probably 3 minutes. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do your calculation, and then I'll tell you what I want you to do next. Just do your calculation. I'm going to set my timer for 3 minutes, and then I'll tell you what I want you to do.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the connection. Please try again in a moment.
Okay, you got about another 30 seconds. Okay, here's what you do. I want you in the chat box to enter number 1 or number 2 for the buyer whose offer is going to be accepted by your seller. Just enter 1 or enter 2 in the chat box.
Looks like we have a lot of 2s coming through, Annie.
Okay. Okay, now I want you to enter the purchase price. Most of you picked the offer number 2. So tell me, I see a few number 1s, but most of you picked number 2. So let's go with number 2 for a minute. Tell me what the purchase price will be for offer number 2. Type in the purchase price for offer number 2. Okay, good. So we're getting some variation. We got more and more number 1s in there. Let's work through these numbers so that you can figure out how we get to the, you guys can quit putting numbers in. We've proven the point. If you haven't looked at the chat box yourself, take a look at the chat box. The price of number 2, the purchase price for number 2 ranges from $225 up to $238.5, I think is the highest I've seen. But there's a whole variety of possible purchase prices, which proves the point that the escalation addendum, even by a bunch of brokers who are very sophisticated brokers, which I'm going to assume most of you are, if not all of you, it's a challenging form to use, and there's a lot of room for error, even by brokers who probably know what they're doing. I agree with you that number 2, the second offer, is the winning offer in this scenario. Why? Well, let's calculate the price for both of them. For offer number 1, the very first line asks you for the purchase price of the competing offer. And it asks you for the maximum purchase price of the competing offer. So with that, we have to use $238,000 as the maximum purchase price of the competing offer for calculating the price for buyer number one. So $238,000 less credits to the buyer in the competing offer. So when we're calculating this guy's price, the competing offer is this one. Credits to the buyer are $500 in repairs. We take that out, subtract that. We come down to a subtotal of $237,500. The next thing that the form says to do is add back in the amount that our buyer's escalation will be, and that will be $500. So now we're back to a subtotal of $238,000 again. And with respect to that $238,000 number, we then add back in the amount of credits that the buyer is asking the seller to pay on behalf of the buyer. What we're trying to do is make it an apples to apples comparison. And since buyer number one wants seller to pay something for buyer's benefit, we have to add that in to the calculation for what the price will be. That will take us up to $242,000, a high purchase price. Is that really what buyer number one would have to pay, however? And the answer is no, because buyer number one capped their offer at $240,000. So the highest they can escalate to is $240,000, even though the calculation itself took them to $242,000. If we assume that their purchase price is then $240,000, where they are capped, the yield to seller is $240,000 minus $4,000, taking seller down to $236,000 as seller's net proceeds, versus offer number two. So now we do the same equation for offer number two. The highest maximum purchase price for offer number two's competing offer is $240,000. From $240,000, we take away the concessions that this buyer is seeking for seller to pay, minus $4,000, takes us down to $236,000. We add back in our buyer's escalation amount of $1,000, takes us to $237,000. We add in the $500 that this buyer is asking for concessions, $237,500. That is within the maximum offer of $238,000. So this buyer's purchase price would be $237,500. The yield to seller is $237,000, which makes offer two a better offer from seller's perspective than offer number one. Are there, Emma, I don't know if you can tell us or not, are there any questions associated with how we got to that price?
I do see from Allison, would you please provide a written comparison so that we can see your numbers? Thank you. And an agreed caret below that.
I don't know if you can see this or not. And I have some scratches on mine. Can you see that, Emma?
Right now with your shared screen, I still just see.
Oh,
going back to your video. Sorry, got to go all the way back. Oh, there you go. Okay, now it's back to you.
Now, can you see that? And I apologize because I did have to cross stuff out and redo it myself because it's a complicated formula.
Gotcha. It's a little hard to read through the thing. Maybe after the meeting, you could take a snapshot of it and I can send it out to everybody so that they can kind of see your breakdown.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay. You're back. You can see my screen again then, right?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. All right. So let's move on then to a discussion of Form 22EF. We'll figure out how to get a picture of the calculations. Or, you know what, Emma, also, there are a lot of brokers in your office there who knew how to do the calculation. They got the numbers right. So maybe even somebody can just show how they did their calculations and get the information out even faster. Okay, sure. Form 22EF, the evidence of funds addendum. We just almost finished. We had a technical glitch in the delivery of videos last week. So we've delivered 4 of 5 Form 22EF videos discussing the use of the evidence of funds addendum. Hopefully you've been able to tune in to those videos. If not, seek them out and we'll get part 5 of the 5-part series out as soon as it's available. 22EF is a critically important form from both buyers and sellers' perspective. If you just look at it at first blush, you're going to think it's a really important form to the seller. It is also a very important form to the buyer, but let's talk about why. The evidence of funds addendum is the form that buyer must use in order to notify seller that buyer is relying on a contingent source of funds. Why is that important? Because Form 21, the purchase and sale agreement, the very first boilerplate paragraph, paragraph A, says that buyer is not relying on a contingent source of funds unless buyer has disclosed in the purchase and sale agreement buyer's reliance on a contingent source of funds. If buyer is relying on a contingent source of funds but fails to make that disclosure, buyer has, best case scenario, misrepresented buyer's financial wherewithal to purchase the property. Worst case scenario, they've committed fraud on the seller because they have induced the seller to accept their offer by encouraging the seller to believe that the buyer has more cash available to them than they actually have. So the boilerplate forms require buyer brokers you to ask your buyer a question when you're filling out the form. It would probably be deemed negligence by a buyer's broker if buyer broker failed to ask this question. What question is it that is so important for a buyer broker to ask? Here's the question. Buyer says, I'm going to get a loan. I'm going to put 80%, I'm sorry, I'm going to put down 20%. I'm going to get a loan of 80% loan to value to purchase the property. The question, buyer broker, that you must ask is, buyer, where is that 20% now? Where is that 20% your down payment plus closing costs? That question has to be asked whether buyer's putting down 20% or 2%. I don't care how little buyer's putting down. Buyer broker, you must ask the question, buyer, where is that money now? And if buyer's answer is anything other than in a bank account in my name, then the funds are contingent funds. If the buyer says, grandma's going to give me a gift, I've got the money in a stock market, I've got the money in an IRA, I've got the money in an SEP, I've got the money in Bitcoin, I've got the money in cash in my mattress at home. All of those are contingent sources of funds. Buyer's funds are only non-contingent funds if they are in a bank account in U.S. funds in the buyer's name. So if buyer gives you any other answer, then you know you have to pull out a Form 22EF and disclose on the Form 22EF that buyer is relying on a contingent source of funds. If you're the listing broker, what's the better option? To get a 22EF disclosing that buyer is not relying on contingent funds. In other words, to get a 22EF that buyer is relying only on non-contingent funds, meaning buyer has the funds in the buyer's bank account in the buyer's name. Is it better to get the 22EF disclosing that, or is it better to simply get proof of funds along with buyer's offer? And I would submit that as a listing broker and as the seller, it is preferable to simply get proof of funds from a buyer that the buyer has sufficient cash to make their down payment and pay their closing costs. So buyer brokers, think about the psychology from the seller's perspective. Form 22EF, when buyer discloses reliance on non-contingent funds, that form requires, Form 22EF requires buyer to provide proof of those non-contingent funds within 3 days of mutual acceptance. If buyer says that they're relying on non-contingent funds and fails to provide proof within 3 days, seller can terminate the transaction. But when a seller terminates the transaction and puts the transaction back on the market, puts property back on the market, everybody knows that that property now goes back on the market stigmatized. May not be a huge deal in today's market where sellers are selling properties like this, but the property goes back on stigmatized, and the next buyer wants to know what happened. The seller is in a better position, buyers, if instead of running the risk that 3 days after mutual acceptance, they've got to put the house back on the market, If instead, along with your buyer's offer, they get proof of funds, they're in a better position. So buyers, thinking strategically about how to get your buyer's offer accepted, when your buyer makes an offer and your buyer has cash, resources, money in a bank to pay the down payment and to pay closing costs, provide proof of that to the seller up front. What does that look like? It looks like buyer putting their offer in one PDF and in a separate PDF, putting their pre-approval letter from the lender and maybe a copy of their bank statement with their bank account number blacked out. Or if they don't want to provide their bank statement for some reason, maybe they have too much cash and they don't want the seller to think that they could increase the price. Maybe instead they want a letter from their private banker that says that I'm familiar with this buyer and the buyer has sufficient funds in our bank to pay, $100,000 in down payment and closing costs, something like that. That all goes to the seller in a separate PDF, all part of the same email. So then buyer broker, your email is dear listing broker, attached, please find buyer's offer. Also attached, please find buyer's pre-approval letter, bank statement showing buyer has sufficient funds, and then whatever else. Maybe they've included the Form 17 showing the buyer's signature on the Form 17, something like that. Separate PDF, all goes to the seller at the same time. Makes a strong presentation. But let's say they don't have sufficient cash resources and they have to instead disclose their reliance on contingent funds, meaning it's any source of funds other than in a bank account in their name. Buyer brokers, you are going to mark the appropriate box to indicate which source of contingent funds your buyer is relying upon. Please understand this issue. This is what I'm about to say is extremely critical. If your buyer already has included a Form 22A in the transaction because your buyer is going to get an 80% loan to value, they're going to put down $20,000. I'm sorry, 20%. But they're going to get an 80% loan to value, so they've already included a Form 22A, you will never, ever reference those financing funds, the 80% on the Form 22EF. The Form 22EF will only ever account for cash that the buyer is bringing to the closing table. It might be the entire purchase price if buyer's paying full cash for the property, or it might be just the down payment. So if buyer is getting a loan, you would not mark the loan box on the Form 22EF. You wouldn't, in fact, if buyers got the 20% in their own bank account, you would disclose no contingent funds at all in that transaction because you've already included the 22A. Same is true if buyer has already included a 22B, the home sale contingency. You would not disclose buyer's reliance on sale proceeds as contingent funds in the transaction. So let's say instead, to make it simple, that buyer is relying on a gift from grandma. On the Form 22EF, you would check the box for gift. You would explain where the money is coming from. And then look down to line 29 on the Form 22EF. Line 29 of the Form 22EF requires buyer to provide proof that they have now converted those funds from contingent funds to non-contingent funds. And line 29 says when buyer has to do that. And by default, it is 10 days prior to mutual acceptance. So this timeline works backwards from every other timeline in the, well, not every other one, but almost every other timeline in the statewide form system. On line 29, boilerplate is 10 days. You would start at the date of closing, count backwards 10 days to determine when the buyer has to provide proof that they have converted those contingent funds to non-contingent funds. Excuse me. Let's talk about a gift from grandma. If I'm the seller and my buyer is relying on a gift from grandma, I don't want to wait until 10 days prior to closing to find out whether or not grandma came through with that money. If it's a gift from grandma, then buyer can go get that money now. And buyer, if you can't get the money from grandma now, why should I take my house off the market for maybe 35 days if we've got a 45-day closing? Why should I take my property off the market for more than a month to see if grandma's going to come through with your money? Instead, I'm going to narrow that from 10 days. I'm going to broaden it. I'm going to broaden it from 10 days to, on a 45-day closing, I might say 40 days. prior to closing. In other words, I might give buyer 5 days for mutual acceptance to have grandma convert the money to buyer's name, get that deposited in buyer's bank account, and provide proof that buyer's got that money in their bank account. If they can't do that, seller can terminate. Now let's think about a way that this form is used quite often in today's market. In today's market, buyer is relying on a loan to purchase the property, but buyer wants to make their offer without a financing contingency in order to make their offer stronger. So buyer says to seller, I'm not asking for a financing contingency, but I am disclosing that I'm relying on a loan. With that, buyer would mark the first checkmark box under the contingent funds section of Form 22EF. Now think about line 29. Now your buyer is relying on a loan secured by seller's property. When is the very first day that those loan funds are going to be available to buyer? Very first day those loan funds are going to be available to buyer is the closing date. So on line 29, buyer broker, you could not leave that line blank, because that line would then say that buyer is going to provide proof to seller that buyer has those funds 10 days prior to closing. No way on God's green earth that could ever possibly happen. And when it doesn't happen, seller has the right to terminate the purchase and sale agreement. So in that scenario, you'd want to make sure that you made that line say 0 days prior to closing. Now take yourself all the way down to the bottom of Form 22EF. The very last provision is where it becomes very clear that Form 22EF is a disclosure. It's a disclosure of contingent funds, but Form 22EF does not create a contingency. Form 22EF creates no contingency benefiting the buyer. All that Form 22EF does is disclose buyer's reliance on contingent funds, meaning that if buyer is unable to secure the funds by the closing date, buyer is in default. Form 22EF does not give the buyer the right to terminate the transaction, does not give the buyer the right to recover the earnest money. Instead, buyer has disclosed buyer's reliance on contingent funds, promised through the Form 22EF that buyer can get those funds. Seller, you do not need to turn down my offer because I'm relying on contingent funds, because I'm promising you I will have those funds by the closing date. So if I don't, I'm in breach. I'm in default of the agreement, and you're entitled to recover my earnest money or go after me with a different claim based on what the face of Form 21 says. That's Form 22EF. Emma, anybody asking questions about 22EF?
We have quite a few on here, so we'll hit the first few and get as many answered, and we'll try to circle back if we have time at the end, but we'll get through as many as we can, guys. So we'll just start at the first ones that were asked. Whoa, that thing's jumping. Okay, in this market, is it always best to include EF on any cash offer? Legalities, ...
So again, from the buyer's perspective, I think you are writing a more strategically effective offer if you eliminate 22EF in place of include, or you could include 22EF if you wanted to. The benefit to seller of 22EF is that there is a single sentence in there that says buyer will not use the non-contingent funds for any purpose other than closing the transaction. So if you include the 22EF, the seller gets the benefit of that sentence. More importantly, though, in a scenario where you have a cash buyer, then including the 22EF strategically is providing seller with proof that your buyer has non-contingent funds already in their possession. So that's where you would include their bank statement or a letter from the bank president, something like that. Okay, one more, Emma.
Okay, Pam wants to know, I see where some brokers want the 22EF for proof of down payment money. Thoughts?
That's what the purpose is for. I mean, that's why we're going to use the 22EF is to provide proof that the buyer has their down payment money. Okay, 22B. Let's get as far through 22B as we can before we take a break. 22B is the singularly most complicated form in the entire statewide form system. And there's no way to avoid that, no way to get around it. Why is it complicated? Because the Form 22B is a bridge. It's a bridge between two totally unrelated purchase and sale agreements. Each purchase and sale agreement is complicated in its own right. Form 22B is the bridge between the two. Form 22B says buyer has to sell a piece of property before they can complete the purchase of seller's property. If you have never used Form 22B before, or if you've not used it enough to be entirely comfortable with all of its provisions, then my advice to you is do not use Form 22B alone. Get assistance from a managing broker in your use of Form 22B until you are so comfortable with its use that you understand all of its pitfalls, because they are abundant. From the seller's perspective, what is the risk of of accepting a buyer's offer with a Form 22B in it? Picture this. You've gone through the whole process of explaining all the competing offers to the seller. They've narrowed it down. They want to pick this offer with a Form 22B in it. You've talked about all of the variables that are out there with all of these offers. And as you're walking out the door, the seller says to you, okay, wait a minute, I'm sorry, I'm confused. You probably told me, but when is this transaction that I've now already accepted going to close? When should I call the moving truck? And the answer to that question is, seller, I have no idea. I have no idea, based on your acceptance of a Form 22B offer, when the transaction is going to close. Because until we know when the transaction will close, the buyer has to sell their house. And only after they have sold their house and established a closing date on that transaction will we know the closing date on your transaction. Because the inclusion of Form 22B in a transaction necessarily eliminates any effect of the closing date on the face of Form 21. The only closing date that now matters is the closing date that's established by the language of Form 22B. And that closing date provision says that the sale of seller's home will close exactly 3 days after the closing of buyer's home. So, seller, not only can I not tell you when the transaction will close, I can't tell you when to order your moving truck, I also have to tell you that you need to keep making the beds every day, and you need to keep taking care of Fido, and you need to keep preparing for people to come through your house, because people are still going to be coming to your house, looking at your house as potential purchasers. So that's one of the reasons, or a couple of the reasons, why Form 22B is less than desirable from seller's perspective. From buyer's perspective, of course, it gives the buyer the opportunity to purchase the seller's home only after they've sold their home, but that comes with a lot of strings. Buyer, you can be bumped as the buyer of this property if the seller accepts another offer prior to you selling your home. So let's look at what that means. Okay. Before we do that, because we've got quite a bit to talk about still on Form 22B, I told you we were going to take 10-minute breaks. We're not. We're going to take 5-minute breaks because we don't have time for 10-minute breaks. So I'm sorry about that, but we're going to take a 5-minute break. And so I'm going to start talking again at 2:05, and we'll talk about the risks associated with buyers using the Form 22B at that point. Okay, come back in 5 minutes.
And remember to keep your cameras on, guys. If I sent you a request to turn your camera on, I promise I'm not being creepy. I'm not staring at you. I don't care what you look like. Just turn it on so you get class credits. I know I've talked to some of you guys about issues that we're trying to figure out, but if you don't have issues and you just don't have your camera on, just turn it on. That's all. Thanks. Thanks everyone who's come back already. For those of you who needed the course materials still or were having a hard time finding them, I added them to the chat so you can find them there if you need them. Annie, I will unmute you right now. One moment. Let me find you. Okay, Annie, you should be able to unmute now.
Yep, I got it.
Thanks.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I forgot that I locked everybody.
Okay. All right, so hopefully we're all back. All right, so Form 22EF, sorry about the short break, guys. I just want to make sure that we can get to some questions, and obviously we just have so little time. Form 22EF, from the buyer's perspective. Let's talk about what this looks like in a real transaction. The buyer has said, I'm going to list my house within 5 days. They get it on the market. If they don't, then they've already waived their home sale contingency addendum. But let's say that they do get it on the market. Now, buyer broker, actually, get on the market. Okay. And they get a sale on the property. They get an offer, and they're going to negotiate the offer. Buyer brokers, you have an enormous job to do, even if you're not the listing broker for their property. If the property the buyer needs to sell is, in the same neighborhood as the home that they're buying, from seller's perspective, that's great because the listing broker and the seller can probably evaluate the saleability of that property, what seller would expect to yield, et cetera, et cetera. But let's say the property is in Arizona. And so that makes seller and listing broker's job harder because they have no idea really what the property is worth. So in addition to not knowing when closing is going to be, we also have no idea what the property is going to be worth or what the likelihood is of selling. But I want to think about buyer for a minute. Buyer broker, properties in Arizona, which means you are not the listing broker, which means you have a huge job to do with respect to the sale of that property. How is that possible? Because your buyer's purchase of the seller's property here in Spokane says that the sale of buyer's property in Arizona will not have a closing date that's less than 30 days or more than 60 days, and it will not be to a buyer who is either contingent on the sale or the closing of a pending sale of buyer's property, of the buyer's property. If buyer's sale, so in our transaction, we have our seller, we have our buyer, and now that buyer's property is listed for sale, we actually have buyer's buyer also. So we have two transactions, the sale between seller and buyer, the transaction between buyer and buyer's buyer. This transaction says that this transaction will not have a closing date that's less than 30 or more than 60 days, or contingent on the successful closing or the sale of buyer's property, this buyer's property, buyer's property, unless this seller has consented in advance of this buyer accepting buyer's offer. So buyer broker, what's your enormous job? Your enormous job is communicating to the listing broker and the buyer on this transaction that they cannot accept an offer that violates the terms of the Form 22B transaction between seller and buyer. Because if they do, then seller has the opportunity to find that the buyer is in default of this agreement, terminate this transaction, and keep the buyer's earnest money. All because in this transaction, buyer entered an agreement with buyer's buyer with a closing date of less than 30 or more than 60 days, or with a home sale or a pending sale contingency. Why do we care so much about the closing date of this transaction? Because remember, the closing date of this transaction is determined by the closing date of this transaction. If this transaction is going to close in 75 days, long closing for some reason, then this transaction can't close it for 78 days. That's not fair to this seller. So that's why we put the window in there of 30 to 60 days. We don't want to jam the seller on the front end or stretch him out too far on the back end. So let's say that buyer has an offer that will close in 25 days. What must buyer do before they can accept the sale of the 25 days from this buyer? They must first get this seller's permission. There is a form to use for getting seller's permission. It is Form 90L. That's the form buyer uses to get seller's consent in advance to seller agreeing to buyer with a closing date of less than 30 or more than 60 days or contingent on a sale or pending closing of buyer's buyer. Let's say that happens. And now buyer enters an agreement with buyer's buyer and gives notice. Under Form 22B, you must give notice to the seller of your pending sale, including a copy of the purchase and sale agreement. We do that. We give seller notice that we've sold the property. With that, buyer has satisfied the home sale contingency. At that point in the transaction, when buyer has sold their home, not yet closed, but they've sold their home, question for you, I want you to answer this question in your own mind. Should the listing broker and the buyer broker then at that point insert a Form 22Q into our existing transaction? Yes or no? The answer is absolutely, unequivocally no. You never, ever, ever, ever inject a Form 22Q into a Form 22B transaction. They have conflicting terms. There are many, many brokers out there who believe that when the 22B buyer has sold their home and it's pending closing, that the party should inject a 22Q into the transaction. Do not let that happen. If the broker on the other side of the transaction says you should do it, say no, you shouldn't. Because for the easiest explanation as to why is because the closing date for the 22Q transaction is the closing date on the face of the Form 21. The closing date in the 22B transaction is 3 days after the closing of buyer's sale. If you inject a 22Q into a 22B transaction, you have two different closing dates. Which one trumps? I have no idea. Instead, we have conflicting provisions for the closing date, and potentially we have no provision. We have no purchase and sale agreement at all because we now have ambiguity as to when the transaction should close or the performance date of the agreement. Okay, so we don't inject a 22Q in the transaction. Instead, we give notice that the buyer has satisfied the home sale contingency and we're marching towards closing. But what happens next? Buyer's buyer terminates the transaction based on the inspection contingency. Now, buyer has to give notice to seller. So buyer gives notice to seller that buyer's had a sale fail. Form 22B controls that transaction still. It says that buyer jumps right back into their home sale contingency status. They're no longer satisfied because this buyer went away. So now we have a Form 22B home sale contingency transaction, and seller is looking for another buyer, and they find another buyer. Seller accepts a bumping offer. Now seller has to give notice to buyer that seller has accepted a bumping offer, initiating buyer's bump provision under Form 22B. Within that bump period, however long it is, I think it's 5 days by default. A lot of people make it much smaller than that. Within that bump provision, or within that bump time period, seller, sorry, I'm not seeing this. Within that bump period, buyer can do one of three things, and only one of three things. Buyer can give notice that buyer's home has sold. In other words, if they, within that bump period, are able to sell their property, they can give notice that they satisfied the contingency and the home is sold. They can give notice that they are unable to sell their home, and with that, this agreement will terminate and seller will move on to the second buyer. Or the third thing that buyer can do is they can give notice that they are waiving their home sale contingency. In other words, seller, I can't sell my house, tried to sell my house, but I couldn't sell my house. So I'm waiving my home sale contingency. And when I waive my home sale contingency, I waive every other contingency benefiting the buyer. So when buyer waives their home sale contingency, buyer also waives their inspection contingency, their financing contingency, title review contingency, any other contingencies that are out there, buyer waives them all when buyer waives the home sale contingency. And buyer agrees that they will close the transaction 30 days from the date that they give their notice of waiver. So buyer brokers, it is a huge deal for the buyer to waive their home sale contingency. Buyers have to understand the significance of that before they waive their home sale contingency, certainly. But more importantly, before they ever enter a purchase and sale agreement using a home sale contingency in the first place. Because in our example that we just used, time passed from mutual acceptance until that second addendum came in. Enough time passed that the buyer was able to sell the house the first time and that sale failed, and then seller finally got a second offer. But in today's market, buyer can enter an agreement, a home sale contingency agreement with seller, and the next day seller could deliver a bump notice because they already accepted a second offer. And with that, buyer is faced with the choice of waiving their home sale contingency, waiving all of their contingencies and closing in 30 days, which is not possible if buyer's relying on a bridge loan, for example. Or they can run away from the transaction because that would be their only option, terminate the agreement. So buyer brokers, if your buyer is in a position where they could close a transaction without selling their home, that's not their first choice, but they could, you need to counsel that buyer about considering an offer that doesn't understand. I'm not suggesting you consider an offer without a 22B if your buyer must sell their home before they can buy. But if your buyer has the option of getting a bridge loan, or your buyer has maybe sufficient funds in a 401k, they don't really want to pull them out, but they could if they had to. Your question to that buyer would be, buyer, if you have an alternate source of funds, the question to you, buyer, is, would you access those other funds rather than losing the opportunity to buy this property? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then strategically, buyer broker, you shouldn't be including a 22B, especially in today's market. Because what you're setting that buyer up for is an opportunity, is the outcome that says buyer is going to, in order to even be able to access those funds, buyer is going to have to waive every contingency and close in 30 days. And what would be better instead is to disclose buyer's reliance on a contingent source of funds. Disclose using a 22EF. The buyer's going to access these funds from a 401k, build sufficient time into the transaction for that to happen, and preserve the other contingencies to buyer that buyer would want in that transaction. Okay, Emma, anything on 22B, questions on 22B before we move on?
Let's see, so, okay, hold on, there's a bunch coming through, so it keeps jumping around. Okay, yes, for the questions being asked about the documents, transaction desk, some people have them in their offices. If you want to take a look at those, that's the place to find them. Okay. Sorry, messages keep coming in, so it keeps shifting down to the bottom. So you kind of touched on it, but the best way to explain the risk to a buyer, or is there a most appropriate way to explain that risk to a buyer?
Yes, the most appropriate way is to really understand the risk yourself. And so buyer brokers, you've got to understand the risks associated with using this form. And of course, the biggest risk is that buyer is going to get bumped. And when buyer gets bumped, what does buyer want to have happen? So the conversation you need to have with your buyer before you ever fill out the 22B for buyer in the first place is, buyer, could you purchase this property without the sale of your house? If the answer to that question is no, there's no way I can complete this purchase if I don't sell my house, then great, pull out 22B and off you go. Because you're never going to run a risk with that buyer where they say, I want to waive the 22B. But if buyer says, yeah, I could, I don't really want to, but I could, then the next question is, okay, so buyer, would you rather lose the opportunity to purchase this property or access those funds to make the purchase happen? And if the buyer says, I'd rather lose the property than access those funds, then pull out your 22B and write it. But if they say, I'd rather access those funds than lose the property, then set your 22B aside and have a conversation with the buyer about what it will look like if the buyer gets bumped and then is faced with the choice of, do I waive my home sale contingency and every other contingency that benefits me, or would I rather be in control of my destiny a bit more by not including a 22B to begin with? I'm still going to put my house on the market as soon as I enter an agreement with this seller. I'm still going to try to sell my home and go that route, but I'm also going to start the process of accessing my 401k funds or getting a bridge loan or whatever it is. I'm going to disclose my reliance to seller on all of these contingent sources of funds. I'm going to set the closing date far enough out that I have time to accomplish everything I need to accomplish, including sale my home if I can, but accessing those other funds if I can't. Okay. Second buyer's addendum, Form 39, is the form that listing brokers, you've got to remember, is out there. The thing that listing brokers you should put into your mind is, if your seller has accepted a Form 22B transaction, seller has an agreement already with a buyer and a 22B in that transaction, what you need to just remind yourself, listing broker, is that seller cannot accept an offer, a second offer, period. They can't accept it. All that seller can do is counter a second offer, because seller's counter is going to include the Form 39. Most second buyers aren't going to include a Form 39 in the offer they make, which means that seller is going to have to counter that offer to include a Form 39. If you allow your seller to simply accept a second offer, your seller will have sold their home twice. Because without the Form 39, seller has no contingency that allows them to get rid of the second buyer if the first buyer is successful in either selling their home or waiving the home sale contingency. Form 39 not only is a critical form to use, but it's also a good form to use. If you look at Form 39, under paragraph 2 of Form 39, there's a series of check boxes. And if your seller marks some of those boxes with the second buyer, then what your seller is telling the second buyer, and your second buyer is agreeing to, is that the seller will not give a bump notice to the home sale contingent buyer until that second buyer has done whatever required by those checkbox marks. So it might be a waiver of financing contingency, waiver of inspection contingency, satisfaction of the Seller's Disclosure Act requirements, etc. So Form 39 is not only essential, it can also be very useful. Form 22Q is the pending sale contingency addendum. If you're representing a buyer who has already sold their home pending closing, and buyer is relying on the funds, the proceeds from that pending sale to purchase seller's home, that's when you would include the 22Q. There are not a lot of moving parts to the 22Q, but there is one really critically important factor from listing broker's perspective. Listing broker, before you accept a Form 22Q transaction, buyer must provide your seller with a copy of the pending sale. Why is that important? It's important for a lot of reasons. Number one, your seller is agreeing to take their home off the market based on the bet that this transaction is going to close. Well, how reliable is this offer for closing? First of all, when is the closing date? Because Form 22Q doesn't change the closing date from the closing date on the face of Form 21. So if your seller is accepting a 22Q offer that has a closing date in 45 days, but the pending sale doesn't close for 60 days, well, we already know we've got a problem. It's a transaction that's impossible to perform. It cannot close. Or if we've got a pending sale where the buyer has agreed to sell their home to a buyer that is also then contingent on another sale closing or the sale of their home, seller, you're accepting a layered transaction. Are you willing to take that risk? Maybe not. So maybe you don't want to accept that 22Q transaction. So listing broker demand a copy of the pending agreement and review it for viability towards closing and how that would factor into your seller. Emma, questions on 22Q?
Unless any come in here in the next couple seconds, it looks like people understand the 22Q.
Good. We're going to move on to Form 35.
Perfect.
So Form 35 is the inspection contingency addendum, and Form 35 is a get out of jail free card. Buyer or listing brokers, your seller should never accept an offer with an inspection contingency, Form 35 in it, without you explaining to the seller that this contingency addendum means that the buyer can terminate for any reason or no reason at all. Some brokers characterize this as meaning that the transaction is voidable by the buyer for 10 days or however long the inspection contingency is. If that's how you want to explain it to your seller, explain it to your seller that way. All I really care about is your seller truly grasping the meaning of this form. And I don't want your seller to understand the form so that they'll reject inclusion of the form in the transaction, because I think that creates a whole host of other problems for the seller. If a seller refuses an inspection contingency to a buyer, that seller is setting themselves up for post-closing liability related to the condition of the property. So I'm not suggesting that, but listing brokers, it's a horrible circumstance for you to be in when your seller's binding purchase and sale agreement is terminated by a buyer who never conducts an inspection. Your seller is furious when that happens, and it should never happen to a seller without them knowing that it could happen. So what do I mean by that? Form 35 doesn't require buyer to hire a professional inspection. Buyer can do their own inspection and terminate the transaction on that basis. And buyer's inspection does not have to be an inspection of the interior of the home. Buyer could, as an example, use their inspection contingency to take measurements of the living room wall while they're viewing the property the first time before they even make an offer. They take a measurement of that wall. It's a competitive market, so they know they have to get their offer in fast. They think they want the house. They get seller to agree to sell it to them. Then they go home and they measure that piece of living room furniture that's going to fit on that wall, holds their TV and all their books and everything else, and they discover the wall is 6 inches too short. I can't buy this house. I'm going to terminate the transaction on that basis. Buyer is entitled to terminate the transaction on that basis. Seller goes, what happened? I've had my house off the market for 8 days. You just terminated it. You never did an inspection. I think you engaged in bad faith. Maybe what the buyer did was purchase another house instead. Maybe that is actually bad faith. But how's the seller going to prove that? And if the seller even did prove that, does the seller get the earnest money in that circumstance? When the purchase and sale agreement says that the buyer has the right to terminate the agreement, essentially with or without an inspection. So listing brokers, make sure your sellers understand that. And then buyer brokers, make sure your buyers understand the operation of the inspection contingency. The inspection contingency breaks itself down into 2 inspection periods. There's the initial inspection period, which by default is 10 days. And then there's the additional inspection period, which by default is 5 days. So let's just talk in terms of those 10 days and 5-day inspection periods as the initial inspection period and the additional inspection period, so that we can all talk at the same on the same playing field. What the Form 35 inspection contingency says is that if buyer is going to have a professional inspection, if buyer is not going to do the inspection themselves, and I mean Annie Fitzsimmons is the buyer, Annie Fitzsimmons does the inspection, not Annie Fitzsimmons' Uncle Joe, but Annie Fitzsimmons personally does the inspection. If I am not personally going to do the inspection, then the only person who can do the inspection is a licensed inspector, licensed under Washington law as a home inspector. Or any person who is exempt from the home inspector statute. So during my initial 10-day inspection period, The only people who can come into seller's home to do an inspection are me personally, or a licensed home inspector, or somebody who is exempt from the home inspection statute. Who is exempt from the home inspection statute? All of these professionals are exempt from the home inspector statute. So buyers, utilize your inspection time wisely. If you have 10 days up front and your initial inspection, you know that you want to have not only the licensed home inspector, but you also want to have the electrical system inspected, or maybe you want to have the plumbing system inspected. Maybe you just want to have a plumber in there to give you a bid for redoing some plumbing that you think is going to be important. All of those people can come in during the initial inspection period, because Form 35 says the licensed home inspector and anybody who's exempt from the home inspector statute. So who's not exempt under the home inspector statute? The one professional who buyers oftentimes want to have into the home during the inspection period is a contractor. And understand, please look at this list. Contractors, building contractors, subcontractors, they are not exempt under the home inspector statute. So during your initial 10-day inspection period, you cannot have a contractor into the home unless seller gives you permission. But if you're able to trigger your additional 5-day inspection period, that is broader, that time period is broader, and it allows you to have specialists into the home, which would include contractors, specialists right here. Use your time periods wisely. If you have 10 days for your initial inspection period and you get your initial inspection done in 3 days, if seller's not going to let you bring a contractor in with permission, then go ahead and get your contractor scheduled for when they can come in during your 5-day inspection period. And then when the time is right, trigger your 5-day inspection period. How do you trigger your 5-day inspection period? You give seller notice using a Form 35R, you mark the box for additional inspections, and you attach a single page from your inspector's report where the inspector recommends additional inspections. If your inspector has not recommended, if the buyer's inspector has not recommended additional inspections for the issues that your buyer wants inspected, go back to the buyer's inspector, go back to the buyer's inspector and ask the inspector to give you recommendations that the buyer needs. A really helpful inspector will give you all of the recommendations for the buyer on a single page, so that all you have to do is take that one page of the inspection report, attach it to the 35R, deliver it to the seller timely, and you've triggered the additional inspection for all of the issues that need to be inspected. Why one page? Because I hope you already know this, but Form 35 prohibits the buyer from delivering a copy of the inspection report to the seller without the seller's permission. Listing brokers, your seller should not be asking for a copy of the buyer's inspection report. Sellers shouldn't want a copy of the buyer's inspection report. And so buyer brokers, you have to operate from the position that seller doesn't want a copy of the inspection report, and you cannot deliver any portion of the inspection report except what is necessary to trigger the additional inspection. And that is the recommendation, one or more, from the inspector for the contractors that the buyer wants to bring into the property. Okay, so now what do we do? We're in our additional inspection period. We've got our contractors coming in. What do we need contractors to do? Why do we have contractors coming into seller's house in the first place? We need the contractor to give the buyer a bid for work that the buyer thinks needs to be done. So inspector has said, look, there's dry rot in the bathroom. I don't know how extensive it is, but the floor is definitely soft. So buyer now brings in their contractor to look at how extensive the dry rot is and what will it cost to repair it. And contractor gives the buyer a bid. It's going to cost $3,500 to replace the subflooring, to replace whatever the problem is. It's an old leak. The leak has been solved itself. The bathtub is no longer leaking, but there's some damage down there. You're going to need to replace the floor and the subfloor. Let's say it's going to be $3,500 to do that. Okay, buyer gets that bid. now the time has come for buyer to ask seller for repairs. So you're going to use Form 35R to do that, and you've got to understand the mechanics of how Form 35R works. Section 1 is buyer's first request section. When buyer asks for additional inspections, you're going to use Form 35R. You're going to mark Section 1 for the appropriate box. You're going to attach the inspector's recommendation for additional inspections. You're going to deliver that to the seller. After you do your additional inspections, because you don't ask for any repairs until all of the buyer's inspections are done. Here's my dog saying hello to all of you and wanting some attention. When all of your inspections are done, then you're going to pull out a clean Form 35R, mark the box for repairs that need to be done. And now you're going to ask the seller to make repairs. What's the best way to ask seller to make repairs? The very best way to ask seller to make repairs is to know what the value of your repairs are. In our example, they were $3,500. The simplest way to make a request to seller is to ask the seller to make a monetary concession. If our buyer was a cash buyer, we would ask the seller to reduce the price by $3,500. If your buyer is not a cash buyer, reducing the price by $3,500 does nothing to help your buyer, because the buyer needs money in their pocket after closing to be able to pay for the repairs themselves. So your buyer would instead potentially ask the seller to contribute $3,500 towards buyer's closing costs. What I recommend that you do in a scenario like that is you write the Form 35R, you ask seller to pay $3,500 of buyer's closing costs, and you pick up the phone before you send it over. And you call the listing broker and you say, listing broker, I'm about to send over a Form 35R asking for buyer closing cost concessions of $3,500. The reason why is because there is softness in the bathroom floor. We had a contractor in there and we have a bid for $3,500. Do you want me to send the bid? Do you want to see the bid? And then you take instruction from the listing broker and the seller about how to proceed. And if the seller says, yeah, I want to see the bid, that seems really high to me, I might want to get a bid for something less. Okay, send it over. If they say, no, really, I can live with that, $3,500, that's a fair price, I'll agree to that, then you're done. You send over the 35R with the $3,500 request, seller agrees to it, and you move on. The beauty of that is that you never then find yourself in the scenario that I hear about on the hotline all the time. Here's what happens on the hotline, or what happens in transactions, and I get questions about it all the time. Buyer sends over this list of repairs that they want to have made. Seller says, no, I won't, I'll do this and this, but not this, and I'll credit you $3,500 at closing. And then buyer says, okay, great, we'll take that. We'll take the $3,500 at closing. And then buyer wants to eliminate the 35R. Why? Why does buyer want to eliminate the 35R? Because buyer's mortgage broker is harping in the buyer broker's ear saying, we don't want this 35R to go to your lender. So get the 35R out of the transaction. Well, what's the problem with eliminating a 35R after it's already part of the agreement? The problem is really simple. It's fraud. It's loan fraud. When you alter the transaction in order to create a perception for the lender that the transaction or the property is something other than what it really is and what is represented by the real terms of the agreement, that's loan fraud. It is a Class B felony in Washington State if you commit loan fraud. If you've been in this business for very long at all, you have already probably dealt with a scenario, either from the listing side or the selling side, where a buyer's mortgage broker has suggested that the terms of the agreement be altered so that a different picture is presented to the buyer's lender. Whenever that happens, a little red flag should go up in your brain, flaring fraud, loan fraud, Class B felony, because that's what it is. So how do you avoid that circumstance? Buyer brokers, draft your Form 35R from the beginning to equate to a monetary concession, and then pick up the phone and have a conversation with listing broker. It's mind-boggling to me how few brokers actually talk on the phone to each other. You zip offers and counter offers back and forth to each other by email, and you never talk. And you might be able to solve a world of problems if you talk to each other. So pick up the phone, have that conversation. If you are in a transaction where it's simply not possible to reach a monetary concession, then the only best alternative, the only alternative in my mind, is that you then, buyer broker, draft your Form 35R, you attach that bid from the contractor or multiple bids if there are multiple bids, and then you write the words on Form 35R, seller shall hire the name of the contractor who's on that bid to perform all of the work identified on the attached bid. When seller agrees to that, and hopefully seller can agree to that, we'll talk in a minute about why that's really powerful for seller to accept that. But when seller accepts that, we have now created a scenario where buyer has identified the contractor, buyer has identified the work that needs to be done. So why is that important to the seller? Think about post-closing litigation. When buyers sue sellers claiming that seller didn't make the repairs they were supposed to make, and seller is the one who picked the contractor, seller is the one who decided what work needed to be done, or seller's contractor, seller is the one who didn't come back to buyer and say, this couldn't happen because of this issue, or I've made the repair, but that repair revealed something else. All of that is off the table if seller can agree to buyer's contractor doing the work that buyer's contractor has said needs to be done. Also, from the buyer's perspective, buyer brokers, I want you to think about how you traditionally write Form 35R. If you're not going to go out and get a bid from a contractor, what's the only alternative? Here's what I see again on the hotline all the time, and it is a deplorable way to draft a Form 35R. But it goes something like this. Seller to hire a contractor, a licensed and bonded HVAC contractor to clean and certify the furnace in good working order. You ever seen anything like that? Buyer brokers write forms like that all the time. And so seller says, okay, I'll do that. Seller hires a licensed and bonded contractor who comes in and cleans the furnace, services it, says, certifies, yep, it's working, but it's about to fail. Something is cracked inside of it, or something is wrong with it, or something going on. But listing seller has done what they said they were going to do. It's working. It's been cleaned and serviced. Nothing obligated them to reveal to the buyer that it's going to die a week later. Buyer brokers encourage your buyers to get their own contractor into seller's home to give the bid to evaluate the work that needs to be done. If we were live in class, what I would hear buyer brokers tell me is it's so hard to get contractors. They're so busy right now, they can't come in. And what I would say to you is, I know it's really, really hard. You've got to develop relationships. And I would ask two questions to the whole class. First, I would say, are there any property managers in the room? And more often than not, I don't know if your offices have any property management capabilities or not, but more often than not, when I'm teaching a class, somebody will raise their hand and say, I'm a property manager. And I'll ask that person, so tell me, if you needed an electrician or a plumber on short notice, could you get one? And that property manager is going to invariably say, yep, absolutely, no problem, I can get one. And then I'm going to ask everybody else in the room, if you needed a lender at 10 p.m. on Sunday night, I know you wouldn't want to bug your favorite lender, but if you needed to, could you get one on the phone? And every broker in the room is going to say, yep, I could get one on the phone at 10 p.m. on Sunday night. And I would say, why? And the answer from both the property manager and the other brokers would be, because I've established a relationship with that person, with the electrician, with the plumber, with the lender, whomever it might be, so that they take my call. They know there's reasons to take my call, and I know I can count on them. So buyer brokers, I know this is not the way you've done business in the past. It's the only reasonable way to do business when your buyer is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase property, to make sure that the property is in the condition they expect it to be in when they get it. Get your buyers, contractors into the property, even if that means they have to pay their contractor $80, $120 to go out and give them a bid. Okay, Emma, questions on Form 35 before we move on?
There are quite a few, so you guys just remember, if we don't get to your question, we'll see if we can make like a list of the questions that didn't get answered to help you guys out in the future. But for now, if your buyer decides to waive the inspection, should you still include the Form 35 and check the box? I did this in an offer I wrote last week, and the list agent didn't understand why I included the Form 35.
So, and I'm sorry, I'm letting my dog out, but I can still hear you because I'm talking on my phone. This is a critical question, and honestly, I would be, your firm might actually have an office policy around this issue, an office policy that says that if your buyer is going to waive an inspection contingency, that you will necessarily include a Form 35 in that transaction, marking the last box on the Form 35 showing buyers knowing waiver of the inspection contingency. Critical. I would, if I was counsel to your firm, I would say that no buyer's offer should ever waive the inspection contingency without the Form 35 being included and that final box being marked. Another question, Emma?
Sure, let's do, sorry, skipping. Some of these are kind of statements. So if you gave statements, great. That's great feedback for everyone to read. Everyone read the chat. Know that you're not alone when you're frustrated with things, because other people are too. Is attaching a 34 and saying see attached Form 34 also considered altering the real terms?
So it depends on the context in which you attach the Form 34. So what I will see a lot of brokers do, and I have no problem with this, they'll use the Form 35R, they'll mark the box, and this happens a lot when you're filling out the seller section because there's just not room to write anything substantively on the seller section of Form 35R. And so a lot of times listing brokers, instead of writing out what the seller will do, they'll write see Form 34. And then they'll direct the buyer's attention to the Form 34, where whatever seller's suggesting is written on the Form 34.
We have time
I have
for
no
one
problem with the I have no problem with the use of Form 34 in that context. Or if buyer broker does the same thing, buyer broker in the buyer section might write see Form 34 and immediately direct the seller's attention. Where I would have a problem with it is, again, if you've negotiated a whole bunch of stuff on the 35R and you're trying to avoid lender from seeing that, and so you replace the negotiated 35R with the Form 34, I have a problem with that. That is lender fraud. Okay, we're going to move on. I'm sorry, I know there's a bunch more questions. Sorry?
Do we have time for just a yes or no question? It's
Sure.
a quick yes, no. Can the contractor be related to the selling agent? Yes or no?
It's not, you know, there are no yes or no questions, but I'll answer the question. Can the contractor be related to the buyer's broker? Was that the question?
It says,
yes,
can the contractor be related to the selling agent?
Which is the buyer's broker. So the question, yeah, the answer is yes, sure. In the right set of circumstances. The answer is also absolutely not in the right set of circumstances. So you have to have context on that question. Is it disclosed to the seller? Is it disclosed to the lender? Because the money going to a contractor or contractor's bid could be one way of just putting money back in the buyer's pocket. Maybe the contractor is the buyer's, well, in this case, it's related to the buyer's broker, but it could be related to the buyer, you know, it could be just a way of funneling money to the buyer. It could be a way of funneling money to the broker. buyer, broker, and firm are taking an enormous risk if it's really an arm's length transaction between buyer and buyer's broker, and buyer's broker is saying, hey, buyer, you should rely on my brother to do the work, or maybe you should rely on Fred Smith and not telling the buyer that it's my brother, then there's a whole host of problems that go along with that. So I'm sorry, it's not a yes or no answer. Your firm probably has some policies around the notion of brokers recommending related contractors. But again, it's just not an isolated issue. I'm sorry. Okay, closing and possession. You may not know that Form 21 says that if possession will occur on any date other than closing, the parties agree at the time they sign Form 21, they agree to sign a Form 65A or a Form 65B when it becomes necessary to do so, at the time of possession, in other words. So let's say that seller is going to retain delayed possession after closing. Form 21 says that the parties agree that at closing, they will sign a Form 65B. So now let's fast forward to a few days before closing. And buyer gets their final loan estimate from the lender, and they know that their payment now, their monthly payment, their mortgage payment is going to be $1,500 a month. And so buyer says, okay, seller wants 10 days of possession, so I'm going to take $1,500 per month. I'm going to prorate that out for 10 days, and whatever that number comes out to be, say $500. So you're going to pay me $500 rent for those 10 days. And so buyer fills out a Form 65B, sends it over to seller. And seller says, no, I'm not signing this. And buyer says, seller, look at Form 21. You agreed to sign the Form 65B. And seller says, yeah, I agreed to sign a generic Form 65B. I didn't agree to pay $500 in rent. And buyer says, well, you're not getting it for free. And seller says, well, I didn't agree to pay. And now what? And now what we have is Form 21 is known as an agreement to agree. Among lawyers, an agreement to agree is known as an unenforceable agreement. There is no agreement at all. You can't hold a gun to either party's head and say, you will sign the Form 65B with these terms on it. It's not possible. So Form 21 ends up being an agreement to agree, and an agreement to agree is an unenforceable agreement. How do we avoid that outcome? You avoid that outcome by negotiating the terms of 65A and 65B at the time of mutual acceptance, even though it doesn't get signed until later. A lot of you might be asking in your own minds, why can't we just sign the 65A or the 65B at the time of mutual acceptance? And the reason is because the language on the 65A and the 65B make that impossible. Because the language says, for example, landlord is in receipt of money in the amount of for rent. Well, at mutual acceptance, neither buyer nor seller as landlord is in receipt of any money from the other party. So you can't, the form has no meaning. You can't sign it at mutual acceptance. These forms are being revised also, and we're fixing that. And I want to tell you, although I can't promise you this because I got to see them in their final form, I think that after the 65A and 65B are revised, I think you will be able to have the parties sign the 65A or the 65B at the time of mutual acceptance, but as it stands right now, you can't. So what you have to do instead is you have to complete the 65A or 65B at the time that you agree to transfer possession, to fill out what the amount of the rent will be, attach it to a Form 34, have the parties initial a Form 34, and on the Form 34, you reference that the attached 65A or 65B represents the form that will be signed by the parties at the time of possession. So let's talk about zero rent, because we're seeing a lot of sellers demand in a competitive seller's market, demand that they get post-closing possession for free. for X number of days. In a world where there is an eviction moratorium in place, meaning that no landlord can evict any tenant quickly, you can evict a tenant if you give them 60 days notice that you're either going to sell the property or occupy the property personally. You could give 60 days notice and then start the process for giving notices to terminate the lease and evict the tenant. Very time consuming and very expensive. That's the only way under our current moratorium on evictions that the buyer could ever get rid of the seller if the seller didn't move out voluntarily. So anytime you're going to create a landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller, it is a huge deal in today's world. And I would encourage you to avoid it no matter what. But if you can't, and the buyer says, I'm a reckless buyer willing to do anything to get the seller's property, and seller wants 10 days of rent-free possession, how do you fill out the 65B? What amount do you put on the rent provision? Do you write 0 there? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. You would never, ever, ever put $0 for rent, even if the buyer has agreed to rent-free occupancy by the seller for 10 days. Why not? Because I want you to fast forward in your own mind to a time when the buyer has got to evict the seller as a tenant from the property. And whenever it is that the buyer would ever be possible, it would be a possibility for the buyer to evict the tenant, the buyer is going to have a damages claim against the seller, the tenant, for when they remove the tenant. And in a landlord-tenant lawsuit for eviction, landlord's damages are calculated, at least in part, based on the amount of rent that was due but unpaid. So if you have a seller in property under a lease that you prepared or a rental agreement that you prepared where the seller owes $0 rent, when the tenant finally gets that seller out of the house 75 days later, what is the buyer's damages claim? They get the tenant out, how much money do they get to compensate for their damages? They would get 0 because you wrote the rental agreement to say that $0 rent is what's due. So make sure, the way you would write that instead then is to figure out what is the high side of fair. If you write this unreasonable rent provision, a court's not going to enforce it. So it's got to be whatever a court would determine as a reasonable rent, but I would write it on the high side of that. So if reasonable rent is anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000, then maybe you make the rent $2,000 and you put that into the rental provision on 65B. And then you would separately agree on a Form 34 or even on somewhere on 65B if there's room. You could separately agree that if seller vacates the property not later than, specify the date, 10 days after closing or whatever the date is, then seller shall owe $0 rent. So you create a rent provision with a rental amount and you give the seller, you liberate the seller to vacate timely and owe 0 rent instead. And so with that, you solve both problems. Okay. Emma, any questions on 65A or B? And I see I failed to click through my slides. Any questions on 65A or B?
It doesn't look any questions, just one statement, hoping the revised 65A and 65B include a place for rental / damage deposits. So not really a question, just a confirm.
I can't remember if it does or doesn't. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so that concludes our discussion of the forms within the class. The rest of the class, we're going to look at other stuff, not forms issues. So let's go ahead and take our 5-minute break right now. I'll actually give you a 6-minute break because it's 2:59, and I'll start talking at 3:05. So I'll see you back here in a few minutes. Okay, let's get started. VA home loans, you guys know more about VA home loans than I do. I'm not going to spend any time talking about this, except to say that if you really have questions about your VA home loans or capacities, then you should talk to lenders. There is some confusion in the industry about what sellers and buyers can pay. The cost that a seller is required to pay under a VA are commissions, real estate brokerage commissions, fees to the brokers, and a termite report, which is, of course, really not something that we have too much of in Washington State. That's different than a home inspection. Buyer can certainly pay for their own home inspection report. Seller can pay no more than 4% of the total home loan, or the total home loan amount. But buyer can pay all of these costs on their own for a VA home loan. Again, if you have questions about VA home loans, talk to a VA home loan specialist. I'm not that person. The REIT is the real estate excise tax. There was an increase, an adoption of a graduated scale for payment of real estate excise tax back in, oh gosh, I think it was probably maybe it was 2019. If your property, the seller's property, is selling for less than $500,000, then the new adopted schedule actually decreased the amount of excise tax that they pay. But for most sellers, it either maintained the level. If you're between 500 and $1.5 million, then there's no change. 1.28 was the original amount. If the sale price of the property is greater than $1.5 million, then the amount of real estate excise tax that's owing from the seller increases with this graduated scale. In that same legislative cycle, and again, I think it was 2019, there was an increase in the B&O tax rate thanks to some very effective lobbying from your Washington Realtors Association. Thank you for your RPAC dollars. The real estate broker or B&O tax did not increase. It was an exception to the increase of B&O tax rates. Fair housing classes. We are not going to talk about the fair housing law itself, except to talk about the classes that are protected in this class. Fair housing is obviously really an important subject to discuss, and so we have an entirely separate fair housing class. But in the core class, what the Department of Licensing wanted us to discuss is just a reminder to you of what classes are protected under the Fair Housing Act. And in Washington, we are controlled by a federal Fair Housing Act, the state Fair Housing Act, which of course both of those apply to everybody in the whole state, and then some local jurisdictions have their own Fair Housing Act as well and may create their own classes. So what the Fair Housing Act says is that it is unlawful for a seller or a listing broker or anybody involved in a real estate transaction to discriminate against the buyer or a tenant seeking the housing based on the buyer's or the tenant's membership in any protected class. So the classes that are protected under federal law are the classes that you see on the screen right now. The classes that are additionally protected under just Washington law are these classes. And the one that is really the reason that we're including this topic on this particular core curriculum is this last one down here, source of income. In 2018, the legislature, just one second, go get your pen, go. The legislature amended not the State Fair Housing Act. While this is showing as a protected class under the Fair Housing Act, it has the impact of being a protected class under the Fair Housing Act, but it actually is part of the Landlord Tenant Act. And so when I say source of income, the prohibition says that no landlord shall discriminate against the tenant based on the tenant's source of income. So this protected class applies to leasing only. It does not apply to sales. And it's not really part of the Fair Housing Act, but it has the same impact as though it were. So it is unlawful for a landlord to discriminate against a tenant or tenant applicant because the tenant applicant is relying on government or public assistance. Think Section 8 housing, for example. Then additionally, local jurisdictions could impose their own protected classifications. These four local jurisdictions definitely have a Fair Housing Act. I don't know that Spokane does. You guys might know better than I do. I'm not familiar with Spokane having one, but I wouldn't be surprised if either the county or the city did have its own Fair Housing Act, creating its own classes for protection. So what is the definition of some of these terms? Many of them are self-explanatory. To the extent a definition would be helpful, here are some of the definitions. Again, we've already talked about the definition of source of income. The other one that's not self-explanatory is the definition of familial status. It's unlawful to discriminate against a buyer because one or more members of the buyer's household is under the age of 18. And the word is household. The word is not family. It's not that a member of the buyer's family is under the age of 18. It's a member of the buyer's household. It could be that I have a neighbor child who lives with me because they have their own unfortunate set of circumstances in their home and they can't live there and they simply live with me. That child would now be part of my household, even though they're not part of my family. I'm not their guardian. I have no legal rights over them. They simply live with me. It would be unlawful for a seller or a landlord to discriminate against me because of that child being in my household. The rest of these definitions are fairly self-explanatory. I am happy to answer questions if you have any questions about any of them. Most times I don't get questions about this stuff. Emma, anybody asking questions about fair housing stuff?
Nope, nothing coming through so far.
Okay, so let's talk about the landlord-tenant law. It was changed very substantially in 2019. It is probably going to be changed very substantially this legislative session. There are two bills right now in the legislature. One of them will make the Landlord-Tenant Act so that it's almost unrecognizable to you from what you know of the Landlord-Tenant Act today as far as landlord rights. It will convey almost all landlord rights to the benefit of the tenant. And then there's also a rent control measure that's percolating through right now. I have no idea if either of those will pass or if they do, in what form they'll pass. If I had to guess, I would say that they will both pass in some form. I don't know what they'll look like when they pass. But the changes that were made in 2000, again, I can't remember if it was 18 or 19, the changes that were already made were fairly sweeping. And so let's talk about those. If you're really familiar with old school, then you're aware that there used to be a 3-day pay or vacate rule. When a tenant quit paying their rent, landlord could give the tenant 3 days notice that rent is delinquent and had to be paid, or else the tenant has to terminate, the lease is terminated and the tenant has to move out. That was changed from 3 days to 14 days. And so now if tenant is delinquent in their rent, and let me back up, no delinquent rent notices can be delivered today because of the eviction moratorium. Landlords are not allowed to, not only are they not allowed to evict, they're not even allowed to give notice that a tenant's rent is delinquent. So 14-day pay or vacate notices are not allowable today at all. And the current eviction moratorium is in place through March 31st. When it is no longer in effect, then the rules we're talking about right now will be in effect. And in that case, it will be a 14-day pay or vacate notice that's required to terminate a tenancy based on unpaid rent. And the only rent that can be included in the 14-day pay or vacate notice is actual recurring monthly rent or monthly fees. It could be the rent, and it could be like a utility payment obligation. But it can't be late fees. It can't be any, an increased, if there was a percentage of the rent that was owing or something like that as a fee. It couldn't be a rental fee for a one-time use of the party room, something like that. It can only be the rent and any other recurring monthly fees. If a tenant is on month to month and the landlord wants to increase their rent, that requires now 60 days notice to increase the rent for a month to month tenant. And finally, from the changes that are already in effect, when a court is asked to issue an unlawful detainer order, an eviction order, it used to be that the court's only question was, tenant, have you paid your rent? But if you haven't paid your rent, it's truly delinquent, then the landlord is entitled to the unlawful detainer order, and the landlord will get their property back. Now the court is required to ask the tenant, how come your rent's not paid? And if the tenant's rent is not paid because of something like illness, job loss, something unforeseeable to the tenant, then the court has the opportunity to say, well, I'm not going to issue this eviction order. I'm going to instead create an opportunity for the tenant to be able to remain in the property and create some kind of a repayment plan or find a way to try to catch up with the landlord. When this statute was created, it was created under the premise that there would also be simultaneously a fund created to pay landlords, to compensate landlords for the unpaid tenant's rent if the tenant got to stay in the property. The law is in effect, the fund never materialized. So now the court can allow the tenant to stay with unpaid rent, but there is no corresponding fund to compensate the landlord. So we'll see if anything happens with that in the legislature this session. Okay.
We have had a couple questions come through, Annie, if you want to touch on those.
Sure.
We got, what are the current rules on comfort animals?
So this applies, so the question is comfort animals. I want to broaden it to talk about all animals. Under the Fair Housing Act, there is no distinction at all between service animals and comfort animals, or emotional support animals is what the title is actually. And so then the reason I'm drawing that distinction is because in some industries there is a difference. And if an animal is not a service animal, Act does not apply. For example, a grocery store or a restaurant can prohibit access by comfort animals, cannot prohibit access by service animals. In the fair housing context, there is no distinction between service and comfort animals. So what I'm about to say applies to all animals, even if they're not truly service animals. Okay. It is unlawful for any seller or landlord to discriminate against any buyer or tenant applicant because that buyer or tenant applicant has an emotional support or service animal, has a, let's just broad categorize it to say a fair housing animal, okay, a fair housing protected animal. So what that means is that when the tenant makes an application, if the tenant says, I have an animal that's protected under the Fair Housing Act, the tenant having that animal is no more significant to the seller, to the landlord, than I would be with the fact that I wear glasses, okay? I have a disability, I'm sight impaired, and I have a corrective device known as eyeglasses to correct or to what's the word I'm trying to come up with? To enable me to see properly, right? So my glasses are a corrective device. To a person who needs an emotional support animal or a service animal, the animal is considered a corrective device for that disabled person. And the landlord or seller can no more discriminate against that buyer or tenant because they have the animal than they could against me because I'm wearing glasses. And that's true if the tenant applicant comes to the party with the animal, or if the animal comes to the party after the lease is already in effect. It doesn't matter when the animal arrives on the scene. Equally, it doesn't matter if the landlord has a no pet policy or requires a pet fee. When pets are part of the gig, pet policies, in other words, don't impact this issue at all, because fair housing protected animals are not pets. They are service animals, they are emotional support animals, but they are not pets, and therefore pet policies don't apply. So a question that's often asked is, what if the animal does damage? If the animal does damage, then when the tenant moves out, the tenant can be held responsible for the damage done by their animal. But it is unlawful for the landlord to require any kind of a pet deposit or damage deposit associated with a fair housing protected animal. All right, Emma, I'm seeing a bunch of chat chiming in, so I'm guessing that there's questions.
Yes, so there's been a few that kind of go along with the animal questions, a few that go back to some of your previous stuff. So let's hit the animal ones real quick. I'll just read all the animal ones to you so you can see if any of them overlap.
Okay.
Regarding animals, we've gotten, why would the tenant even mention the animal? Wouldn't it be hard to prove discrimination if they don't get the property? Another was, can you ask for proof, and what would that look like? Or can a landlord require paperwork for the pets?
So let me answer that question, because I should have covered that already.
Sure.
Seller or landlord, whoever is being asked to make an accommodation regarding the animal, because that's what it is considered as an accommodation. If the landlord, for example, has a no pet policy and they're being asked to allow the tenant who has a service animal or fair housing protected animal, then the landlord is being asked to make an accommodation, which they are required to make. But before the landlord is required to make the accommodation, the landlord is allowed to ask a single question, and that is, can I have proof or documentation that you require this animal to accommodate some disability? And then the tenant will provide a letter from a qualified person, a doctor, a medical clinic, psychiatrist, whomever it might be, a qualified person to establish that they have a disability and the animal is necessary to accommodate that disability. And something that happened under the Trump administration, when Ben Carson was the cabinet person in charge of the fair housing, the HUD, in charge of HUD, a new rule came down which was landlord friendly and corrected something that had become a problem. And because it corrected a problem, it was a problem not only for landlords, but also for tenants. And here was the problem. People were abusing the Fair Housing Act by going online and paying $15, $25 to somebody who held themselves out as qualified, a counselor, to assess that, yes, this person has a disability and this animal is necessary to accommodate. Meaning, in other words, the letter that's required became absolutely meaningless. And so that worked not only to the disadvantage of landlords, but to people who were truly disabled, because landlords were getting all of these letters from people who really weren't disabled, and it was becoming a very bad situation. So with the rule that came out under the Carson administration, or the Carson HUD, the requirement for proof that the animal was necessary for a disability required more than simply an online letter. It required an establishment of a relationship between the tenant and the provider. So for example, if the letter came from, I live in the Belfair area. If my letter came from like the Belfair Medical Clinic and it was signed by somebody, wet signature, maybe a stamped signature, but it still evidences that there was actually a personal relationship between me and the provider, that letter would work. But if it was a letter from an online provider, that letter doesn't work. And so the reason I went through the process of telling you that it came out of the Trump administration is I don't know what's going to happen now. I don't know if that's going to get undone under the Biden administration or not. I don't think it's been undone yet in a day. So it's still, as far as I know, the law of the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act. But it's something that we as an industry should pay attention to and see if that changes. Okay, now let's move on. Every year in the core curriculum, the Department of Licensing wants us to find a way to say to brokers, let's play nice in the sandbox. And I've never really been all that successful at figuring out how to teach, as a matter of, real estate law, the principle of playing nice in the sandbox. And so I've said it in a variety of ways over the course of time when I've taught the core curriculum. But I decided that maybe instead, in this version of the core curriculum, the best way to do it is to just give you some hotline question examples of brokers who have had trouble getting along. And maybe if you're the outsider looking in and you're bringing kind of an overview perspective to it, you can say, boy, this scenario looks different from a bird's eye view than it would if I was one of the brokers involved in the transaction. So think back on your own transaction. Before we get to this question, think back on some of your own transactions when things have really gone off the rails. And it might be between you and the other broker. It might be between the parties. Think about the origins of that disharmony and think about how you could have acted differently from the inception of the problem to create a different outcome. So here's one example. Seller sends an amendment to the buyer, which really means listing broker sends an amendment to the buyer broker, right? An addendum with 2 changes. But the buyer only puts one initial in the middle of the page. The listing broker says to the buyer broker, hey, thank you for that, but you need to initial both of the revisions. And the buyer broker says, no, he doesn't. The buyer doesn't have to initial both of them. One initial in the middle of the page is sufficient. And this creates enough of a controversy between the parties that I get asked a question on the hotline. So if listing broker and buyer broker are bickering about this issue, what do you think listing broker is saying to seller? And what do you think buyer broker is saying to buyer? And what is this controversy doing to propel the parties towards a successful closing? My suspicion is it's doing nothing to propel them towards a successful closing, but it could be doing a whole lot to create a problem for a successful closing. So think about how easy it would be to create this controversy between buyer and seller, and think about how easy it would have been to resolve and not have this controversy between buyer and seller. And so with that in mind, just some principles to think about before the next time you want to get sideways with buyer or seller. Whenever you have a controversy that creates a winner and a loser, right? Like in this scenario, you have whoever is going to get the initial or not get the initial is going to win this battle. So we're going to have a winner in this battle, but creating a winner also creates a loser, and it sets an adversarial tone for the transaction. So whenever it's possible, my suggestion would be yield to the request of the other broker. And I'm not saying that it's always going to be possible, because sometimes the broker on the other side of the transaction is asking for something that's just wrong. And if they're asking for something wrong, then you certainly wouldn't agree to it on your own behalf or on your client's behalf. But if it's okay to yield to their request, yield to their request. For example, what would it have hurt the buyer broker to simply have the buyer put another set of initial on the forms? Now, in reality, maybe it would have changed the date of mutual acceptance of that form. So maybe it would have been a problem to do that. but maybe it wouldn't have been. So yield if you can. The other thing I would say is communicate frequently and gracefully. However it is that you're communicating, communicate frequently. If it's by phone, great. If it's by email, great. If it's by text message, great. It has to be in a documentable format. It has to be a format that your firm can then retain in their transaction folder going forward. But think about how you communicate, right? You guys are as aware as I am that it is so easy to be harsh with the written word, more harsh with the written word than you would be perhaps in a face-to-face conversation. So think about how your email words are going to come across to the broker on the other side of the transaction before you send them flying out of your computer. Know the forms and the law so well that you know when you can yield and when you have to stand your ground, right? If you know, for example, I said, don't ever inject a 22Q into a 22B transaction. If you do, you will create an internally inconsistent transaction. So if the other broker says, hey, let's put a 22Q in this 22B transaction, you know that's a time when you are not going to yield. You are going to stand your ground on that issue, because as a matter of transaction preservation of the transaction itself requires that you don't yield on that. But if you know the forms well enough, you can explain to the other broker why you can't inject a 22Q. A, we don't need it because 22B controls this, and B, it will cause a conflict for the closing date. So know things well enough to be able to explain what's going on and know when you need to stand your ground. And then finally, call in your managing broker, call in your resources. If you have a problem in a transaction before it goes crazy, get backup. Because perhaps when the two brokers are going like this, the two managing brokers could talk and resolve the problems. All right. Let's figure out if this is a problem that can be resolved. If a listing broker delivers the 22AL early, so the 22AL is the Form 22A paragraph 2 notice. It's the notice that asks the buyer to identify who their lender is, that they've made timely loan application, what they've supplied to their lender, etc. If a listing broker delivers the 22AL earlier than 10 days, can I, as the buyer broker, just ignore it and wait to see if they'll redeliver once the proper amount of time has passed? If they don't redeliver, the early copy is basically invalid, correct? I just had one delivered one day early, and instead of trying to be cunning, I'm going to just suck it up and respond with my 22AP. But in the future, if I wanted to push the issue, what are my options? Can you just imagine the broker asking this question? If I want to be a thorn in the side of the other broker, if I want to be as obstreperous as possible, is it okay for me just to say, I'm not going to do it? I'm going to ignore it or pretend like you didn't submit that 22AL. Now, I guess that where the broker is coming from, they're saying, look, my buyer has these rights under the agreement. When they get the 22AL, they have to respond to the 22AP. But if they never get the 22AL, they don't have to provide the 22AP. So if the 22AL is not delivered properly, is that the same thing as not getting the 22AL? So I understand the mindset, but does it also just sound like this buyer broker is setting the buyer up to be in an adversarial and controversial relationship? And wouldn't it make a lot more sense to help the buyer understand when they get this 22AL, here's what you have to do with your 22AP. Let's be prepared to respond. And if there's confusion over the delivery of the 22AL, pick up the phone, call the listing broker and say, hey, listing broker, I think you delivered this a day early. Do you want to deliver it again timely because I'm not sure it's effective the way it was? And then listing broker, to your point, why would it matter to simply say, okay, I have delivered early, but solve problems instead of creating adversarialness. Next one. I have a listing. The seller filled out the Form 17 and forgot to disclose an insurance claim that took place the year before. She told me about it when we first met, but I forgot about it. We got an offer and the buyer discovered the claim 4 days into the deal. He asked if I knew, and I said yes. The buyers had waived the inspection contingency and the right to terminate based on Form 17. I sent an addendum acknowledging the insurance claim and gave the buyer the right to terminate. Buyer said he didn't want to terminate. He said he'd already talked to an attorney. He says he plans to remodel and open the walls, and someone will pay if he finds mold. I asked, are you threatening to sue us? And he said, I'm not giving you legal advice, listing broker, but you could consider giving up commission and I would hold you harmless. He emails me and texts me a lot. He says, only God knows if I'm telling the truth. He's a licensed broker. I'm pretty scared and feel horrible that I forgot about the repaired leak. So I would love to invite some of you to unmute yourself. In fact, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself, because as you hear this, I think it's really important as a community of real estate brokers to have a plan for how you would respond to somebody like this. I mean, I think we can all agree that the buyer on the other side of the transaction is not being a nice guy at this point. He's not being a team player trying to get this transaction closed. You guys could probably come up with some other adjectives for him, and I would too if I wasn't the instructor in the class. But how do you deal with somebody like this? Go ahead and unmute yourself and tell me what you think.
File a complaint.
Go ahead. I hear somebody talking. You're on. You got the stage.
Oh, file. There's like that broker complaint. I don't remember the exact form, but it's like you can file a complaint or call their managing broker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you call their managing broker?
No, I'd probably have my managing broker call their managing broker.
Okay, good. I agree. This is a perfect situation for a broker to say, especially when the broker says, I'm pretty scared and I feel horrible that I forgot the repaired leak. If a broker's feeling pretty scared in a transaction, that's the first sign that you need resources, right? Yeah. You need to call on your backup. You need to go to your managing broker. You need to get assistance. Anybody have any thoughts on the fact that I forgot the repaired leak? Does anybody question whether or not this is even something that the listing broker did wrong?
No, and she made it right by offering for them to terminate based on that. So that to me would be pretty clear that they had a chance.
Yeah, I agree with you. First of all, I'm not sure there's a disclosure obligation. If the leak has been repaired and the damage around the leak has been repaired, I'm not sure what the disclosure obligation was to begin with. But as you say, she did also then give the buyer, or the seller gave the buyer, the right to terminate. So contractually, the characterization of the transaction has changed. And now the buyer is simply being a bully, right? So brokers, when you're this particular fact pattern, I think is fairly egregious. It's really easy to call this particular buyer a bully. But brokers, whether you're the buyer broker or the listing broker, and you don't have to be a new broker, you don't have to be a young broker, but a lot of times that's who is the person most impacted by these issues. Anytime you're in a transaction and the party or the broker on the other side of the transaction is doing something that intimidates you or scares you, or sometimes it's even more subtle than that. They're just the smarter broker, the more knowledgeable broker, and they're telling you what the forms say and what your client has to do. Anytime you feel like there's this inconsistent rub of, that doesn't feel right to me, go get help. Don't just say, okay, well, that other broker on the other side of the transaction has been doing this for 30 years. They must know what they're doing. Because that broker on the other side of the transaction might be taking advantage of you and your client. Go get help. You guys are part of an incredible real estate firm. Windermere has all kinds of resources. Go get help. Okay. Timely presentation of offers. We're going to have another slide to discuss here in a minute. And I'm going to ask for you to unmute yourselves and discuss the next one when it comes up also. But first of all, let's introduce it. The agency law requires you to make timely presentation of offers, all written offers and other written communications to or from the parties. There's two words in there that are not defined, and we have to think about what they mean. And one is timely, and the other is present. What does it mean to be timely? There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. You might have a seller who says, I am super duper 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 anxious to get this house sold. I'm going to be sitting by the phone waiting for you to tell me that you have an offer. Timely for that seller is different from the seller who says, yes, let's get this house listed. I'll review offers in a week because I'm going to be on a submarine going down to view the Titanic, and so I won't be available to get offers for a week. Okay, timely is different for those two sellers. But what's important is that the seller defines timely. Listing broker should never define timely. If it's inconvenient to the listing broker, that's too bad. The offer gets presented. Present, what does it mean to present? Does that require face-to-face? Could it be presenting by email? Could it be presenting by phone? It could be all of those things. And again, it depends on who your client is. If your client is a sophisticated investor who buys and sells 3 or 4 houses every month, then you can probably present on the phone or by email and have a conversation with them long distance. If your seller is a 94-year-old woman who just lost her husband a few months ago and she's never transacted business on her own, then you probably need to sit across the table from her and help her understand the terms of the agreement. So presenting also has to be controlled by the client. So understanding that presentment has to be made timely, and it affects all offers, all counter offers, even if the property is already subject to a purchase and sale agreement. Think about this fact pattern. Seller delivers a counter offer. So first of all, what is the significance of that? Seller delivers a counter offer. That means that there's a buyer out there who wants to buy the seller's house. Seller didn't accept the buyer's terms, but counter offered back to the buyer. And a counter offer can be withdrawn prior to its acceptance. But once it's accepted, then seller is locked into that counter. A second competing offer is delivered to the listing broker. The listing broker is notified of the competing offer. However, listing broker is handling another unrelated urgent situation. I'll tell you that in this particular case, the listing broker was handling a medical situation in her own home associated with her son. Listing broker quickly reviews the competing offer, but has questions for the competing buyer's broker about the offer. Shortly thereafter, the first buyer accepts seller's counter. When listing broker notifies seller of everything that happened, seller is angry that listing broker did not immediately notify seller of the second offer. How could listing broker meet the demands of seller and balance the requirements of other clients and issues? So understand what's happening in this transaction. The counter offer is out there and another offer comes in that seller would have liked the opportunity to consider. And seller had the opportunity to consider that offer until when? Until this offer gets accepted. Because once this offer is accepted, he now has a binding agreement. And this seller says, look, I might not have accepted this other offer, but I can't now even negotiate with this other buyer. And had you timely presented the second offer to me, the backup, the competing offer to me, I would have instructed you to withdraw the counter offer. But because you failed to timely present, I didn't have the opportunity to do that. Thoughts?
So I would think that even a quick text message, if I was in the middle of an emergency or something, I could make a quick text message to my seller and just saying, there's another offer in, it's this much. I have an emergency going on right now, but I want to talk to you about it. I mean, I think unless I were the one laying on the floor suffering a heart attack or something, that it would be possible to do some kind of communication.
I would say an immediate phone call, or you could have another agent deal with it immediately.
Okay, anybody else? I agree with both of those suggestions, and particularly in hindsight, right? It's easy to look at this scenario in hindsight and go, yeah, that's what I could have done to have avoided the problem. The reason why I think it's really important to have a discussion like this one is that if you don't think about something like this in advance, then what's the likelihood when you're dealing with some kind of a medical issue associated with your son that you're going to stop and think, the seller's counteroffer could get accepted in the next 10 minutes if I don't do something. The questions that I have for the buyer's broker, they're probably not as important as at least getting the offer to the seller. I have a managing broker who will help me with this kind of an issue, or I have somebody else in the broker in the firm who will provide backup to me and who can help me with an issue like this. Or even if I don't have a formal presentation to make to the seller, if I just pick up the phone and have a quick conversation and let them know. Again, if my seller is sophisticated, as this seller obviously was, maybe that's all that's required. I have so much sympathy for this broker because I get that in the real time as this happens, she's dealing with an issue associated with her son and she's thinking, okay, I can take care of this in 20 minutes or in 2 hours. I don't really know what the passage of time was, but I get it. But seeing it in hindsight, I also completely understand the seller's perspective. So I think it's really important. Alice and Mary both made really good suggestions of what this listing broker could have done in this scenario if she had thought at the time about how important it was to do some of those things in the scenario. Okay, multiple offers and good broker practices. Listing brokers, it is the seller's marketplace, and that means all kinds of wonderful things for the seller, but it only means wonderful things for the seller if the seller actually gets a buyer who's going to close the transaction, right? They might raise the price, they might be willing to pay more than the list price, they might even pay more than the appraised price, but it only matters if they can actually close the transaction. So listing brokers, I think it's up to you to counsel your sellers in advance that although it's a really strong seller's market, there are still things we need to do to protect you in the transaction. For example, sellers, it's really important that when the buyer makes an offer, if they're getting financing, we need to make sure that they're using a competent lender. And to the extent we can do so, we want those buyers to come with underwriting pre-approval. Is underwriting pre-approval a thing in your market? I'm looking at 6 of you, so shake your heads, and maybe I'll see the 6 of you who are shaking your heads. Okay, I can see Gay, and she's shaking her head, so I'm going to use her as my barometer for all of Spokane to say that underwriting pre-approval letters are a thing. And so what do I mean by underwriting pre-approval? Underwriting pre-approval means that in advance of finding the house the buyer wants to purchase, they have already submitted their entire loan package to the lender. And the lender has taken that loan package, put it all together nice and pretty, and submitted it to the underwriter. And the underwriter has reviewed the buyer's financial qualifications and come back with a letter that says there are only 3 conditions to closing: satisfactory appraisal, homeowner's insurance, title insurance. And as long as we get those 3 things, this buyer will get the loan. That is an underwriting pre-approval letter. That is very different from a traditional pre-qualification or pre-approval letter based on nothing more than a phone call between the lender and the buyer, and maybe the lender running a credit report for the buyer. So your marketplace may or may not be in a place yet where sellers can demand that buyers come with underwriting pre-approval letters, but I do think the industry is moving that direction. So buyer brokers, to the extent your buyer is dependent on financing to close the transaction, make sure that your buyer is getting an underwriting pre-approval letter. If you're working with a buyer right now who is not yet in a purchase and sale agreement, that buyer should be at the lender submitting their loan package right now so that they can get underwriting pre-approval. And if your buyer is working with a lender that won't give underwriting pre-approval, that won't give a letter conditioned only on those three things, appraisal, homeowners insurance, title insurance, then get your buyer to a different lender because that lender is not competent. When you're representing the seller and you receive multiple offers, consider it a fair housing issue. Anytime you get multiple offers, consider that you're going to have a fair housing complaint. And protect yourself and your firm by documenting your firm's transaction folder with the justifiable business reason that the seller selected the offer they selected. It might be price, it might be closing date, might be contingencies, might be the amount of earnest money, might be any number of factors, but there has to be a justifiable business reason. Because the complaint that we are seeing sweep the nation right now, there's a NAR hosts a listserv for the state legal council, the state association legal council. So all of us who are hotline lawyers for each of the 50 states, we can all participate in this kind of group share email. And right now there are multiple states where sellers are facing fair housing claims by buyers who are alleging that the seller discriminated against the buyer based on nothing but the buyer's name. So the buyer's saying, I'm not saying that the seller ever saw me. I'm not saying that the seller got a letter or a picture or anything like that from me or of me. But based on my name alone, I'm saying that this seller chose not to sell to me. And sellers are having to defend those claims. And brokers are having to defend those claims. And the only way you defend a claim like that is by being able to show the justifiable business reason that your seller selected the offer they selected. So make sure you've documented your file with that information so that after the fact you can provide it if it's necessary. Love letters, if you have to deal with a love letter, here's my favorite way of handling it. If you're, first of all, counsel your sellers up front. Buyers sometimes bring these things we refer to as love letters. What it really means is that the buyer is writing you a letter telling you all the things about themselves that they can't put forth in a written offer. They're telling you maybe about the makeup of their family or their lack of a family, their background, their religion, what they do. All of this is stuff that you're not allowed to consider, seller, in determining which buyer you want to select. So seller, my advice to you is that we say up front, you don't want love letters. That's my recommendation to you, seller. And then you can put that out there in the MLS that the seller does not want to receive love letters, yet the seller still may receive love letters. If the seller still receives love letters, what I suggest that you do to present them, let's say you've got 5 offers and 3 love letters. You present all 5 offers, you keep the 3 love letters in a manila envelope sealed. Okay, all of your love letters and your offers all go with you to the seller's house. You present the 5 offers, 3 love letters are in a sealed manila envelope. Seller, which of these 5 offers do you want to pick? I want to pick offer number 2. Okay, they pick this offer. Now you say, seller, I've got 3 love letters in a manila envelope. You told me originally you didn't want to receive love letters, but nevertheless, here they are. Do you want to read them? And the seller says, no, I don't want to read them. Great. You have the seller sign across the seal of the envelope, sign acknowledging that they were provided this envelope with the love letters in it and they chose not to open it. They sign it, they date it. If they want to open it, then that's up to them. They open it. Hopefully, their minds don't change about the offer they want to accept based on their review of the love letters. If their mind changes about the offer seller wants to accept based on the review of the love letters, then you're either going to have to counsel your seller against that because they seem to be violating the Fair Housing Act, or you're going to have to figure out what happened and see if you can still document a justifiable business reason for the offer that they chose to accept. But it puts you in a position where there's no easy answer. You're going to have to fashion your way through it. And it might be a situation where your seller is actually violating the Fair Housing Act. And if that's the case, you have to withdraw yourself from that transaction. You cannot continue. You cannot continue to represent a seller who you know is violating the Fair Housing Act. Okay, competently use or avoid the escalation addendum. We've talked enough about that. When you do put a buyer in backup position, use the backup addendum. The best way to keep things clear as to what's happening. And then make sure you're timely presenting all offers. We're almost done here. I know we've got some questions. I'm going to go through the last slides, 2 slides super fast. We'll have about 5 minutes for class. In your firm, the buck stops with the designated broker, branch manager at the branch level. There is no team, there is no licensing structure for teams. Whatever your team is what you've created within your firm. A broker can only supervise or exercise right of control over other brokers in the performance of real estate brokerage services if that person has a managing broker's license. Designated brokers, it's up to you, branch managers, it's up to you to make sure that teams are operating within their licensing allowed structure. And then whoops, oh, that was the last slide. I thought there was one more. Okay, questions?
Okay, the questions that came through on this last part, some of them were statements more than questions. A lot of them were, we thought that a seller could sell their property to whomever they wanted. Then a few comments that were statements.
So let's talk about that for a minute. Go ahead, Emma, I'll let you review the questions and I'll give you time for another one before I'm done here. But it is a true statement that seller is free to sell the property to whomever they want, subject to the Fair Housing Act. That's the one constraint. So seller is not permitted, seller is prohibited from unlawfully discriminating against a buyer based on the buyer's membership in a protected class. It's just that simple.
Let's see.
Another question?
Another question, what if you don't live where the seller is? How can you deliver a sealed love letter?
I haven't come up with a solution for that one yet, except for to say, I mean, I think I would try and do it electronically. I would email the seller. I'd have a conversation, maybe have a conversation with the seller up front first, just because that's going to be easier flow. But then you confirm it all in writing and you tell the seller in writing, I have received 3 letters from, I've received a letter from 3 of the buyers who've made offers. You initially told me that you did not want to receive letters. You only wanted to receive the offer and then proof of their financial qualification. Please instruct me as to how you want me to proceed with these letters and get the seller to write back to you in their own words that they do not want to receive these letters. They want you just to hold them in the firm transaction file. They don't want you to read them. They don't want you to tell them about them. I mean, I'd be as specific as possible. Anything else?
I have one here from Steven. I'm not 100% sure what you're asking, Steven. So if you want to unmute yourself to clarify, he said, why can't you accept whatever answer you want? So Steven, if you want to unmute and explain what you mean by that, then go.
Yeah, that was just typo. I was just going back to the whole question about accepting an offer that you want to accept. I mean, essentially you're saying if they have any reason they want to accept an offer, it could be, well, because they didn't write, they want a 3-day neighborhood inspection contingency. That's good enough, but it almost like the seller is guilty before innocent when it comes to that fair housing. If I have to provide all this information, or if I have to provide like adequate reason why I didn't accept your offer. If my seller just says, no, I just picked that one because that's the one I wanted. I have to worry about that, or we need to protect them.
Yeah, you have to worry about that because they get 5 offers and only one of them is from a person who's not African American, and they say, oh, yep, I want that offer. But it happens to be the lowest price, the most contingencies, and the longest closing date. That seem right? No, it doesn't seem right. Now, that's an egregious example. It's easy to say, no, that doesn't seem right.
Right.
But play that out in whatever scenario you want to. If you've got a multiple offer scenario, you have to be thinking about fair housing. As a listing broker, you have to consider this as a fair housing issue because we are just seeing so many fair housing claims get asserted. You have to consider any multiple offer scenario as a fair housing scenario, and you have to document your file accordingly.
So then you're saying essentially those levels are very controversial then, because I mean, if they changed our mind, then like you said, you're basically opening yourself up for litigation.
Yeah, this lawyer listserv I was talking about, the NAR lawyer listserv I was just talking about, was just talking today about a lawsuit that was filed in Massachusetts because a seller had orally accepted or had acknowledged that that they were going to accept this buyer's offer. And this was before they had, somehow or another, I think that what the state is already doing in this state, I think it's Massachusetts, and they're already advising listing brokers to present multiple offers in table form, calling out the various features of the offers and identifying buyers as buyer 1, buyer 2, buyer 3, buyer 4, buyer 5, as opposed to by their name. And so this seller had acknowledged that they were going to accept buyer number 2's offer. And then they got the offer and they saw that the name was whatever it was the first name of one of the buyers, indicated to the seller that this buyer was probably African American